On the evening of April 3, 2021 in northwest Houston, a young Vietnamese woman named Linh Chi clicked post on her phone. The message appeared simple, but its words would echo through an entire community. If suddenly no one can find me, or if I'm found dead, please check my husband. Within hours, that single line of text began traveling quietly through social media. An uneventful note to some, a whisper of fear to others, while somewhere in the same city, the first signs of her disappearance were already unfolding. Good evening, and thank you for being here tonight, because the story I'm about to tell you is one of those cases that keeps investigators awake long after the lights go out. Linh Chi was 30 years old, that spring born and raised in Vietnam, the kind of person whose energy filled every room she entered. She had moved to Texas 6 years earlier after meeting Curtis Allen Holliday through a chat app called WeChat. He was nearly 3 decades older, a former soldier turned small business owner who sold discount household goods out of a warehouse on West Sam Houston Parkway. Their friends described Lynn as gentle, meticulous, always smiling. She loved vanilla coffee, took care of her 4-year-old daughter like the center of her world, and called her Aunt Simon-Law in Vietnam every Sunday evening. Her Facebook was full of photos from family picnics and karaoke nights at Houston's Vietnam town. In those pictures, she looked happy, but underneath the smile was a woman slowly losing her sense of safety. Curtis had a temper that could change without warning. He kept track of her phone, her friends, even her errands. Still, Lynn believed that patience and love might soften him. Her aunt worried that faith like that can be dangerous. Houston in April is humid and unsettled, a city of wide streets and quiet suburbs where people know each other by first name. Neighbors wave from driveways, children ride bicycles past rows of blooming azaleas. It is the kind of place where doors are locked, but troubles feel far away. The house on West Little York looked ordinary enough, beige siding, trimmed yard, nothing that would hint at a secret. To anyone passing by, the couple inside seemed stable, quiet, safe. Exactly the kind of home where nothing bad was supposed to happen. That Thursday evening, April 3rd, Lynn's routine unfolded as always. She cooked dinner, played with her daughter, sent a few messages to her aunt, and stepped outside to bring in laundry from the porch. Neighbors later said they heard nothing unusual. At 8:30, her phone pinged for the last time on a tower near Curtis's warehouse. By the next morning, calls went straight to voicemail. Her aunt kept trying. When no response came for days, she filed a missing person report. Officers arrived at the house on April 28th and were greeted not by Curtis, but by his ex-wife holding the couple's little girl. Her explanation was strange. Curtis had asked her to watch the child while Lynn handled personal matters. The officers looked around and noticed something that felt wrong. Lynn's car was in the driveway, her passport and phone still inside the house. No one could explain why a mother would leave her own child with her husband's ex-wife and vanish without a trace. Detectives in Harris County quickly realized this was no simple domestic dispute. They interviewed neighbors, searched nearby parks, checked airports and bus stations. Nothing. It was as if Linh Chi had walked off the face of the earth. Then they learned about Curtis's restraining order for domestic violence and his recent arrest for violating that order. When they put the timeline together, a cold truth emerged. He had broken the order during the very week his wife disappeared. The case that began as a missing person report was now a probable homicide investigation. Police entered the couple's house with a search warrant and found everything spotless, too spotless. The air smelled of cleaner, and the floors glistened under flashlights. Forensic officers bagged samples from the sink, drained the bathroom tile, and tiny fibers caught on the washing machine filter. Outside, a patrol car idled beneath the streetlight, while neighbors peeked through curtains. The search team worked in silence, each aware that somewhere inside this house lay the first clues to an unimaginable crime. If you're the kind of person who stays up late listening to stories like this, who finds something compelling about the mysteries that law enforcement can't quite solve, then I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that subscribe button and maybe drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now, because there's something about late nights that makes these stories hit differently, isn't there? Now, before we go any further, maybe lock your door if you haven't already. Turn off the lights if you're feeling brave and just listen. Because outside right now, the rain has started at first, just a few drops tapping softly against the window, then building slowly into a steady rhythm, the kind of sound that makes the world feel smaller and the darkness feel closer. And it's in that darkness with that rain, as our soundtrack, that I'm going to tell you exactly what happened to Lin Chi. Detectives didn't yet know that the truth they were searching for was sitting behind a locked metal door 10 miles away in a warehouse full of discount appliances. All they had were contradictions, a missing wife, a restraining order, and a husband who seemed to know more than he would ever admit. As rain pattered on the patrol car's roof, one officer looked toward the dark sky and said, "She did everything right. She asked for help. We just didn't hear her in time." The investigation was only beginning. What they would find next would shock even the most experienced detectives in Houston. By the time the missing person report reached Harris County headquarters, nearly 4 weeks had passed since anyone had spoken to Lin Chi. Each day that slipped by made the chances of finding her alive smaller. Investigators began piecing together her last known movements, like fragments of a puzzle scattered across Houston. The first call logs showed that at 8:30 p.m. on April 3rd, her phone had connected to a cell tower near the warehouse owned by her husband. After that silence, no social media activity, no bank transactions, no travel records. For a woman who called her aunt every Sunday and posted pictures of her daughter almost daily, that silence was deafening. Detective Maria Cortez, a veteran investigator known for her precision, took the lead. She visited the couple's house on West Little York Road again, walking slowly through rooms that felt frozen in time. The laundry basket sat half full, a child's drawing hung crooked on the refrigerator, and a single coffee cup rested in the sink with lipstick still on the rim. Nothing seemed broken or out of place, yet the absence of disruption only deepened the unease. It was as though the life that once filled these rooms had simply evaporated, leaving the air heavy with questions. Neighbors described the family as quiet. Mrs. Thompson next door said she often saw Lin Chi watering the small rose bushes near the porch while her little girl played on the sidewalk. She never heard arguments, never saw police cars. Curtis, she said, was polite but distant, the kind of man who smiled without warmth. When officers asked if she had seen Lin after early April, Mrs. Thompson frowned and said, "Not once, just him always, him coming and going at odd hours." Another neighbor mentioned hearing a truck engine, late one night, a deep mechanical hum, fading down the street around 9 p.m. She couldn't say which night, only that it felt out of place in such a quiet block. Detective Cortez ordered a forensic sweep of Curtis's vehicles and warehouse property. The warehouse itself stood behind a chain-link fence, its sign half-faded letters peeling from years of heat. Inside, the air smelled of cardboard and motor oil. Rows of used appliances formed narrow corridors of metal and shadow. The officers moved carefully between the aisles, cataloging anything that didn't belong: footprints in dust, fingerprints on packaging, taped newly replaced locks. One officer noted that a large freezer stood gleaming near the center, brand new, still bearing its manufacturer's sticker. They marked it for later inspection, but lacked probable cause to open it that day. At the time, it seemed insignificant. Meanwhile, detectives traced Curtis's activities through credit card records. On April 4th, just one day after Lynn disappeared, he purchased cleaning supplies, heavy-duty trash bags, and a box of plastic wrap from a hardware store on North Shepherd Drive. Surveillance footage confirmed his presence alone, wearing latex gloves, even before entering the store. When confronted about this, he said he was deep cleaning the warehouse to prepare for new inventory. The explanation sounded rehearsed. To understand the marriage, investigators interviewed Curtis's former spouse, the same woman found caring for the child. Her statement painted a troubling picture. She claimed Curtis had always been controlling and had grown unpredictable with age. "He wants obedience," she said. "When he feels someone slipping away, he panics." She added that Curtis had called her, suddenly asking her to watch the child for a few days. When she pressed for details, he hung up. She hadn't heard from him since. The revelation confirmed what detectives feared: Curtis's story about Lynn traveling for personal matters was a fabrication. Detective Cortez obtained court records showing 2 restraining orders filed by Lynn Chi earlier that year after incidents of domestic assault. Each time, she withdrew the complaint days later. Friends said she believed he would change, that he had promised to seek counseling. That pattern: violence, apology, hope, silence, had repeated until it ended in disappearance. Reviewing messages from her phone backups, investigators read lines that chilled them. "He said he will destroy me if I ever leave." Those words, dated 1 week before she vanished, turned a missing person inquiry into a presumed homicide case. As the team expanded their search, they brought in cadaver dogs to sweep nearby wooded areas and drainage ditches. For 2 long days, handlers led the dogs through overgrown lots, while helicopters circled above. Reporters gathered outside the house, their camera lights flickering through the blinds. Curtis avoided the press, telling officers he had nothing to say until his lawyer arrived. When he finally agreed to an interview, his tone was cold, mechanical, as if he were reciting lines from a manual. He insisted that Lynn had run off with another man, that he was being framed. Yet, when detectives asked for that man's name, he couldn't produce one. His composure cracked when they mentioned the new freezer. A brief tightening of his jaw, a shift in posture, small but unmistakable. That night, Detective Cortez sat alone in her car outside the warehouse gate. The streetlights cast long pools of amber light on wet pavement, and she noted the faint hum of industrial compressors behind the fence. Something about the sound gnawed at her. She wrote in her logbook, "Need warrant for storage unit, possible concealment." In the distance, the city settled into uneasy quiet. No storm tonight, just heavy air and the promise of revelation. Across Houston, Aunt Simon Law sat staring at her phone in disbelief. She had hoped every ring would bring good news, that her niece might somehow walk through the door again. Instead, she would soon learn what investigators were beginning to suspect. The woman who had posted a cry for help was not missing. She had been silenced by the very person she feared most. The next morning, the request for a full search warrant was approved. By dawn, the investigation would move from questions to discovery, and the door to that warehouse would finally open. When investigators dug into Curtis Allen Holliday's history, they found a man who had spent most of his life needing to be in control of something: people, money, situations. He'd served in the army in his youth, then drifted through jobs until he opened a discount goods business. Those who knew him described a pattern that never changed: charm first, authority next, anger last. Every relationship followed the same 3 steps. It was as if he measured his worth by how much obedience he could command. For years that temperament had gone unnoticed behind the polished manners of a southern businessman. But inside the small world of his marriage, the facade had already begun to collapse. Detective Maria Cortez and her team compiled dozens of digital records, emails, bank statements, social posts. Buried among them were voice messages from Lin Chi saved to her aunt's phone. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic, describing how she'd tried to keep the household peaceful. She mentioned a bruise she blamed on an accident and a moment when Curtis threw her phone against the wall because she had smiled at a male cashier. Each message was dated closer to April 3rd, and each sounded more frightened than the last. To Cortez, they weren't simply messages, they were evidence of escalation. While forensic analysts worked on the samples from the couple's house, another team began tailing Curtis's daily movements. He still operated the warehouse, opening the gate every morning at 9, closing it before dusk. No shipments left, no deliveries arrived. It was an empty routine designed to look normal. Detectives noted he often stayed inside for hours with the doors locked. When questioned, he claimed he was doing inventory. The explanation was hollow, but without a warrant to search sealed containers, they could only wait. Late one afternoon, Cortez visited the hardware store again to speak with the clerk who'd sold Curtis the heavy-duty cleaning supplies. The clerk remembered him clearly. He was calm, almost too calm, he said. He asked for plastic sheeting, bleach, and a respirator mask, said he was redoing tile grout. He also remembered that Curtis had paid in cash. Those details filled the blanks in the timeline and helped secure the warrant that Cortez had been waiting for. Back at the precinct, officers studied the warehouse's layout. Blueprints showed a main floor packed with merchandise aisles, a small office in the back, and a locked storage annex not listed on the business permit. That annex became the focal point. By Thursday morning, a search team of 6 assembled with evidence, technicians, and a van for potential recovery. Cortez led them herself. She had learned from experience that the first 10 seconds of entry often reveal what weeks of paperwork cannot. At 10 a.m. they arrived. The warehouse smelled of old cardboard and motor oil, the sound of ventilation fans humming through the stillness. Sunlight slanted through dusty windows, catching particles that floated like faint smoke. Cortez called out for Curtis, but the echo that returned was hollow. No answer. They began sweeping aisles one by one, marking boxes and taking photos. In the middle aisle stood the freezer, large, bright, white, and spotless. It didn't match the surroundings. Everything else was second-hand, scuffed, used. This machine looked as if it had arrived yesterday. A small lock held the lid shut. Cortez crouched beside it, gloved hands resting on her knees. The metal surface was cold to the touch, even though the unit wasn't plugged into any visible outlet. She noted condensation along the rim and a faint chemical smell, ammonia and disinfectant mixed together. The team photographed the serial number, recorded temperature readings, then moved toward the rear office. Inside, they found a computer, piles of invoices, and one crumpled receipt dated April 4th for deep freeze chest unit. The seller's name matched the appliance store already on their list. The puzzle pieces were beginning to lock in place. Meanwhile, uniformed officers detained Curtis at his residence for questioning while the search continued. When informed that the warrant had been executed, he protested, saying he had nothing to hide. But under the interrogation lights, his calm broke into fragments. His eyes darted each time Cortez mentioned the warehouse. When she asked about the freezer, he leaned forward, voice tight, "That's for food storage. Inventory overflow." She didn't respond, just stared until he looked away. In her notebook, she wrote one sentence: "He knows what's inside." Back at the warehouse, technicians used bolt cutters to remove the lock. They decided to wait for Cortez before lifting the lid. Hours later, she arrived with the evidence van trailing behind. The team gathered in a semicircle around the freezer. The hum of the building, fans filled the silence. She nodded once. A technician pulled the lid upward. Cold vapor spilled out like mist. Inside, wrapped tightly in layers of plastic, was the unmistakable shape of a human body. The room went still. For a moment, nobody spoke. Cortez reached for her radio, her voice steady but low. Unit 6, confirm recovery. We have remains. Outside, the street carried on as normal, trucks passing, engines rumbling, unaware that behind the locked gate, a story of love, control, and fear had just reached its inevitable revelation. News of the discovery spread within hours. Reporters crowded outside the Harris County building as the coroner's van pulled away. Inside the precinct, Cortez stood by the evidence table, looking at the sealed photograph packet. She had seen many crime scenes, but this one lingered. A woman who had begged for help was now reduced to a case file number. In the quiet after the chaos, she thought about the thousands of people scrolling past that Facebook post weeks earlier, reading the words, "Please check my husband," and moving on. How many of them had felt something was wrong but dismissed it as drama? She closed the file and whispered to herself, "She warned us." The words sounded less like an observation and more like an indictment. The case of Lin Chi was no longer a disappearance. It was a homicide, and one that would reveal piece by piece the meticulous cruelty of the man she once trusted. The hum of the evidence van followed Detective Maria Cortez all the way back to the Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences. Inside the white container behind her, the body of Lin Chi lay sealed beneath thick layers of frost and plastic. The ride was silent. Even the technicians who normally filled long drives with nervous chatter kept their eyes fixed on the road ahead. Everyone knew that what waited inside that freezer would determine whether this case stayed circumstantial or became a murder trial. At the morgue, forensic pathologist Dr. Elaine Carter oversaw the slow thawing process. It took nearly 12 hours before the ice softened enough for examination. The first thing they noticed was the precision of the wrapping multiple layers of industrial plastic, each bound with duct tape, each fold pressed tight as if measured. Whoever did this had taken time, not acted in panic. Beneath the plastic, Lin's features were pale but intact. The absence of decay preserved everything, the bruising along her jaw, faint pressure marks on her neck, and the discoloration that hinted at asphyxiation. There were no stab wounds, no blood loss. "Doctor," Carter spoke quietly. He didn't want her to bleed. He wanted her to disappear. Back at the precinct, Curtis Holliday waited in an interview room, arms crossed, expression blank. Two detectives sat across the table, a camera blinking red in the corner. When they informed him that the freezer had been opened and that a woman's body was found inside, his reaction was unsettlingly restrained. He didn't shout or deny. He simply exhaled and looked toward the floor. After several seconds, he said, "Then you already know." Detective Cortez entered moments later, placing the crime scene photographs on the table. "We need to hear it from you," she said. Curtis's voice trembled slightly, not from grief but exhaustion. He claimed Lin had fallen, that she wasn't breathing, and that he didn't know what to do. He said he panicked, wrapped her body, and hid it until he could think. Cortez listened without interrupting, then slid the purchase receipt toward him. The date printed in black ink, April 4th, one day after Lin's last phone signal. His story dissolved. The interrogation continued for 6 hours. Bit by bit, the man who had once demanded control began to unravel. He confessed to inviting Lin to the warehouse that night, under the pretense of talking things out. When she arrived, they argued about divorce and custody. She told him she couldn't live in fear anymore. According to his statement, she tried to leave. He grabbed her arm, she screamed, and in his words, "I just needed her to stop." The phrase echoed through the room like static. He described pressing a pillow over her face until she stopped moving. The silence that followed that admission felt endless. When the written confession was complete, Curtis signed his name with shaking hands. He requested to see his daughter. Cortez refused. "She'll see you in court," she said. News of the discovery broke that evening. Local TV stations ran continuous coverage. Houston businessmen arrested after wife found frozen in warehouse freezer. Crowds gathered outside the police station, holding candles and photos of Lynn. Her aunt Simon Law spoke briefly through tears, saying her niece came to America for love and found a nightmare. The community's grief turned to anger as details emerged. Domestic violence hotlines reported a surge of calls within hours, each from someone who had heard Lynn's story and recognized pieces of their own. The autopsy report confirmed suffocation as the likely cause of death. No defensive wounds, no drugs, no alcohol, just bruising consistent with restraint. Forensics also found Curtis's fingerprints on every layer of wrapping. Prosecutors now had a clear timeline: assault, concealment, purchase, a freezer cleanup. What they lacked was motive beyond control, yet that alone was powerful enough. During the preliminary hearing, the defense tried to argue accidental death. They claimed Curtis acted out of panic, that he hid the body out of fear of deportation for Lynn's relatives. The judge's expression never changed. The evidence list was too heavy to move around. When the court adjourned, Detective Cortez stepped outside into the cool Houston evening. The city lights shimmered across wet asphalt from an earlier drizzle. Reporters pressed microphones toward her, asking if justice had been served. She simply said, "Justice doesn't bring her back." The words traveled across every channel, played between commercials and weather updates, yet none captured the exhaustion in her tone. Weeks later, Lynn's funeral was held at a small Vietnamese church on the city's south side. The pews overflowed. Photographs lined the altar: her wedding day, her daughter's birthday, the smiling teacher who believed kindness could heal anger. Her child clutched a small stuffed bear while relatives sang softly. Outside, people left white lilies along the steps. For many, the case had ended, but for those who loved her, it would never close. Back in the evidence room, Cortez sealed the final bag from the warehouse, a child's drawing found taped to the freezer wall, crayon lines spelling "Mommy." She wrote the case number and placed it beside the others. The hum of the refrigeration units filled the air. Another reminder of how an ordinary object, a simple household appliance, could become the centerpiece of horror. For the detectives, the next phase would be trial preparation. For Curtis Holliday, it would be the rest of his life spent explaining how love turned to possession and possession to murder. And for everyone who had once scrolled past that Facebook post, it would remain a question without comfort. How many warnings are lost because we don't want to believe them? 9 months after Lynn Chi's body was found, the case of State of Texas v. Curtis Allen Holliday moved into the gray courtroom of the Harris County Criminal Courts building. A thin crowd filled the pews. That morning, neighbors, friends, domestic violence advocates, each one there, because the story had become more than a headline. It was a mirror for every unanswered cry that ended with silence. Curtis entered in a dark jail uniform, wrists chained, expression flat. When he looked up and saw his daughter sitting with her aunt in the front row, his face tightened for the first time since his arrest. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Paula Gaines, opened simply, "This case is about control." She showed the jury photos of Lynn's injuries and the receipt for the freezer. She played the voicemails Lynn had sent to her aunt, each more frantic than the last. When the recording ended, the courtroom was silent except for a child's soft cry in the gallery. The prosecution walked through the timeline in methodical detail: the argument, the suffocation, the purchase, the concealment. Every step proved deliberate. Curtis's defense attorney argued that the death was an accident brought on by a heated fight. He insisted his client had snapped under pressure, then panicked and hid the body. The jury listened without expression. The defense called no character witnesses. There were none to call. When Curtis took the stand, his voice shook as he recounted his version of events. He avoided the word killed. He said it happened. He said I lost control. But each statement was met with evidence that proved otherwise. The store receipt, the gloves, the plastic wrap, the precise layers of tape all showed planning, not panic. When Dr. Elaine Carter testified, she explained how the injuries were consistent with manual suffocation and how the freezer had been set to its lowest temperature before being unplugged. Her final statement was clinical and terrifying. This was not an accident, it was preservation. Those two words hung in the air like a sentence of their own. By the fifth day, it was clear that a jury verdict was a formality. Curtis agreed to a plea deal to avoid a capital murder trial. He pleaded guilty to murder in exchange for a 15-year sentence. In the gallery, murmurs of disbelief rippled through the crowd. 15 years for taking a life seemed a whisper of justice. Aunt Simon Law stood and spoke through a translator. She was 30 years old. My family will serve a life sentence without her. Even the court stenographer paused for a moment before continuing to type. After sentencing, officers escorted Curtis down the corridor toward the holding cells. Reporters shouted questions. He ignored them until one asked if he felt remorse. He stopped, turned slightly, and said, "I wish she had just listened." Those were his final public words. Outside the courthouse, the sky was clear and colorless. Dozens of women stood holding signs that read "Her voice matters" and "Say her name, Lin Chi." News cameras captured the moment her aunt stepped into the crowd, lifting her niece's photo high above her head. It wasn't a celebration, it was a promise. The case had become a symbol for every silent victim who feared their warnings would be ignored. Detective Cortez watched from the sidewalk, coffee cooling in her hand. Reporters tried to pull her into interviews, but she declined. The investigation was over, yet the weight remained. In her office, she kept a copy of the Facebook post that had started it, all printed in black and white and pinned above her desk. "If I'm found dead, please check my husband." It served as a reminder that warnings don't always come as shouts. Sometimes they come as whispers we scroll past without listening. Lin Chi's story spread far beyond Houston. In Vietnamese communities across America, churches and social groups held memorials. Domestic violence advocates used her name in workshops and seminars, teaching how digital posts can serve as modern cries for help. Her daughter was placed under the guardianship of her aunt, growing up in a house where her mother's picture stood by the window. Every birthday, they lit a single white candle and read one line from her favorite book of poems. 2 years into his sentence, Curtis filed an appeal, claiming ineffective counsel. It was denied without hearing. He now spends 23 hours a day in a cell at the Telford unit in New Boston, Texas. Guards say he rarely speaks. He keeps a Bible open to the same page each day, a psalm about forgiveness that few believe he understands. For Detective Cortez, the case became a benchmark of how truth hides in plain sight. For the city of Houston, it was a lesson in listening before it's too late. And for the audience who followed the story, it was a reminder that sometimes the most disturbing part of a crime is how predictable it was from the start. In the months after the trial ended, Houston moved on. The way cities always do, traffic returned to the highways, shops reopened, and headlines faded under newer tragedies. But in a quiet neighborhood on West Little York Road, a small house still carried the weight of everything left behind. The windows remained shuttered, the mailbox filled with unopened flyers, and the faint outline of police tape still clung to the edge of the fence. For the people who lived nearby, it was no longer just a house. It was a reminder of how easily safety can lie. Aunt Simon Law took custody of Lin Chi's daughter that autumn. The child, barely 5, had learned to answer questions about her mother with silence. Simon decorated the girl's bedroom with paper cranes and bright lanterns, hoping color might soften memory. Every Sunday evening, she set 2 bowls of rice at the kitchen table and lit incense for her niece. She said it helped the child understand that love doesn't end, even when presence does. The neighbors often dropped by with groceries, and sometimes they stayed for tea, speaking in quiet tones so the girl could sleep without fear. Detective Maria Cortez visited only once after the funeral. She left a single white rose on the porch and slipped an envelope under the door. Inside was a photo of Lynn smiling at a community fair, holding her daughter on her shoulders. On the back she had written, "She is remembered." For Cortez, closure was never about conviction. It was about acknowledgement. The case had changed her. She began volunteering with a local outreach group that helped immigrant women navigate restraining orders and language barriers. When reporters later asked why she chose that work, she said, "Because the signs were there and we ignored them." The Houston Police Department implemented new guidelines after the case. Officers handling domestic violence reports were required to document every social media post connected to a complaint, no matter how trivial it seemed. In briefings, trainers played recordings of Lynn's voicemail messages to illustrate what escalation sounds like when hidden behind politeness. Younger recruits often looked down during those sessions, realizing how easily empathy can be replaced by routine. Meanwhile, the Vietnamese community organized a memorial scholarship in Lynn's name for women pursuing degrees in education, the career she once dreamed of. The first recipient, a young teacher from Saigon, wrote a letter to her family. "I will teach children to listen because silence can kill." That sentence appeared on every brochure the Scholarship Foundation printed. Across online forums, Lin Chi's story continued to circulate. It became part of digital awareness campaigns, a symbol used by advocates, warning that subtle threats should never be dismissed. Each retelling began the same way: a Facebook post, a plea, a vanished woman. And always the same haunting question: what would have happened if someone had taken her words seriously? Curtis Holliday served his time quietly. Prison records noted no disciplinary actions, no visitors except a public defender checking on appeals. Inmates called him the Freezer Man, a name he pretended not to hear. Every year on April 3rd, the anniversary of Lynn's disappearance, a small group of women gathered outside the warehouse where the freezer was found. They brought candles and lilies, standing in silence as trucks rumbled past. Some were survivors of abuse, others friends of victims, all drawn to a place where tragedy had once lived. For Lin Chi's daughter, the years ahead would be filled with unanswered questions. When she asked about her mother, her aunt told her the truth gently. She was brave enough to speak, even when no one listened. The girl repeated that line at school for a project about heroes. Her teacher wrote in the margin, "Your mother would be proud." By the time the case reached its 3rd anniversary, the warehouse had been sold to new owners. They painted the walls white, replaced the floors, and reopened it as a thrift store. Yet those who knew the history said the building still felt cold, no matter the season. Some claimed that when you walked down the middle aisle, the air turned still as if holding its breath. Detective Cortez drove past once on her way home and saw the new sign above the door. She didn't stop. She only slowed long enough to whisper a silent apology to Lynn, to the child, to every person who had written their fear into the void and never been heard. Then she drove on the city's lights, stretching behind her like fading stars. Lin Chi's story would end here, but its echo would carry forward. It would live in courtroom training manuals, in community meetings, in whispered warnings between friends. And though justice had come, it arrived too late to matter to the one who needed it most. Because sometimes justice is not about punishment, it's about finally believing what someone said from the beginning. The file on Lin Chi's murder was finally archived on a gray morning, nearly 2 years after the trial. Detective Maria Cortez stood in the records room, sliding the box labeled HC20211745 onto the steel shelf, among thousands of others. The thud it made was small but final. Cases close that way quietly, without ceremony, yet they never really end. She brushed the dust from her hands, thinking about how many stories began with the same pattern. A warning ignored, a door unopened, a voice dismissed. The warehouse had been cleaned out, the evidence sealed, but its echo lingered in every domestic violence report that crossed her desk. By summer, new cases had already replaced the old ones. Reports stacked up, phone calls rang through the night, and the city's rhythm swallowed the silence that Lynn had left behind. Cortez sometimes caught herself staring at the printout of that Facebook post pinned above her desk. She knew that somewhere someone else was typing similar words into a screen, hoping they would reach someone in time. Half a world away, in a quiet suburb of Sydney, Australia, another woman was living her own version of that fear. Her name was Tran Thi Kim, known to friends as Kim Tran, a 48-year-old mother of 2 who had come to Australia decades earlier seeking peace. Her life looked ordinary: a small house in Bankstown, a vegetable garden behind the fence, children who laughed easily. Yet beneath that calm, she carried a growing sense that the world outside her front gate was closing in. On the night of February 13, 2025, Kim Tran spoke to her sister over the phone. The conversation was routine: family gossip, dinner, plans, a reminder to lock up the house before bed. Her sister would later remember one strange line near the end: "If anything happens, tell the kids I love them." It was said softly, almost as a joke, but the unease beneath it was unmistakable. 2 days later at dawn, smoke rose over Beverly Hills, a suburb just minutes from Bankstown. Firefighters arrived to find a vehicle engulfed in flames at the end of a service road near the bushland. When the fire finally died down, they discovered a charred SUV, and inside it the remains of a woman. Investigators quickly realized that the missing person report, filed only hours earlier, matched the victim's description. Her name was Kim Tran. The news traveled quickly through Sydney's Vietnamese community. Headlines read, "Mother of 2 found dead in burned car, police treating as suspicious." For many it felt like déjà vu. Another woman, another warning missed, another family waiting for answers that might never come. Detective Sergeant Alicia Nguyen, a second-generation Australian of Vietnamese descent, was assigned to lead what would become one of the most disturbing investigations in New South Wales in years. She had grown up hearing stories like Lin Chi's from relatives in Houston, and when she saw the first crime scene photos, she felt that same chill of repetition. "It's always the same pattern," she told her partner. "A woman senses danger. No one listens until it's too late." Back in Houston, Cortez read the online article about the Sydney case. She paused at the photo of the burned vehicle, the caption describing a mother taken from her home before sunrise. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the fluorescent ceiling light flickering above her. "Different continent," she murmured, "same silence." Then she closed the tab and whispered a small prayer for whoever would have to walk that case from start to finish. The world is full of stories that mirror each other in ways too painful to ignore. Different names, different languages, the same fear. And sometimes just when one case closes, another begins carrying the same message forward, like a warning carried on the wind. That case in Houston had ended with a freezer. The one in Sydney would begin with fire. At 3:45 in the morning, February 13, 2025, the quiet streets of Bankstown lay under a haze of pale streetlight. In a narrow brick house at the corner of Welfare Avenue, 48-year-old Kim Tran stirred awake to a noise outside, metal scraping against metal, soft but deliberate. She thought it was the wind shifting the gate, then she heard footsteps on gravel. By the time she reached the window, a dark van had stopped across the road, headlights off, engine idling. Moments later, her front door splintered inward. The neighbors would later tell police they heard shouting, then a single muffled cry. When the commotion stopped, the street fell silent again, except for the fading sound of tires grinding over asphalt. By dawn, all that remained inside Kim Tran's home was an overturned chair, a broken teacup, and her phone lying face down on the floor. That morning, her daughter Lynn woke up to find the kitchen empty. The kettle was still warm rice, cooking in the pot, television humming low from a half-played morning show. She called out for her mother, assuming she had gone to the garden. When no one answered, she walked through every room, confusion turning slowly to panic. Within an hour, she called her uncle, then the police. Officers arrived just before sunrise. They found no sign of forced entry, except the shattered door frame and muddy footprints leading toward the street. It was as if Kim had been lifted out of her own life, leaving everything still in motion around her. By 8 a.m., New South Wales Fire and Rescue received reports of smoke rising near a service road off King George's Road, a short drive from the Tran residence. Firefighters arrived to find a silver SUV engulfed in flames so intense that trees 50 meters away were scorched. The fire burned for almost 20 minutes before the last embers dimmed. Inside, they discovered the remains of a single occupant in the driver's seat, body unrecognizable. The license plate matched Kim Tran's vehicle. Detective Sergeant Alicia Nguyen arrived at the scene, the smell of burned rubber and fuel hanging thick in the air. She had worked arson cases before, but nothing this personal. The victim's identity was soon confirmed through dental records. When the call came through, she closed her notebook and whispered, "They didn't just take her. They erased her." News spread quickly. Within hours, the story appeared across Australian media. Bankstown mother found dead in burned car, police investigating possible kidnapping. Reporters gathered outside the Tran family, home cameras aimed at the scorched driveway, their voices filling the morning with speculation. Neighbors stood behind fences, whispering to one another, shaking their heads. "She was such a kind woman," one said. "Always helped with community events. How could anyone do that to her?" Detectives began reconstructing the timeline. Security footage from nearby homes showed a dark van circling the block around 3:30 a.m. It parked for 7 minutes before the home invasion. Another camera half a kilometer away captured the same van heading toward Beverly Hills at 4 o'clock. There were no other vehicles on the road. No license plate was visible, but the distinctive broken rear light gave investigators something to trace. Inside the house, forensic teams collected fibers, fingerprints, and a small trail of soil leading from the living room to the driveway. Kim's purse was still on the couch, her phone locked with a passcode, her wallet untouched. Whatever happened, robbery wasn't the motive. Detective Nguyen noticed a faint smell of fuel near the threshold, a sign that accelerant might have been used during the abduction. By afternoon, the Tran family arrived from across Sydney, their faces pale with disbelief. Kim's husband, a long-haul truck driver, collapsed to his knees at the sight of the ruined door. Their son clutched a rosary, muttering the same question over and over. Why would they do this? No one had an answer. At police headquarters, investigators gave the case a name: Strike Force Bushfield. The goal was simple: track the van, trace its occupants, and uncover why a mother had been taken from her own home before sunrise. But beneath that objective, every officer knew they were facing something deeper. This was no random act. It was calculated. That night, Detective Nguyen sat at her desk, staring at the crime scene photos. Burned metal, melted dashboard, fragments of glass fused with bone. She closed the folder, her reflection faint in the darkened window. In that silence, she thought of her own mother, who still lived a few suburbs away, always locking every bolt on the door before bed. She thought of all the women who believed they were safe until the moment safety vanished. Outside, Sydney moved on traffic lights, changing trains rumbling in the distance, life continuing as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But in that single neighborhood, one house stood empty, its door boarded up, the smell of smoke still clinging to the curtains. And in that emptiness, the first pieces of another impossible case had just fallen into place. The day after the discovery of Kim Tran's burned SUV, Strike Force Bushfield convened its first full briefing inside a sterile conference room at New South Wales Police Headquarters. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and exhaustion. Detective Sergeant Alicia Nguyen stood before a whiteboard, crowded with grainy security stills, timelines, and red marker circles. At the top, she had written 2 words in block letters: "Why her?" Investigators replayed the sequence of events minute by minute. At 3:30 a.m., the van with the broken taillight appeared on camera circling Welfare Avenue. At 3:45, it stopped outside Kim's home. At 4 o'clock, it was captured again near the service road where her vehicle was later found burning. The entire abduction and transport had taken less than 20 minutes. Whoever planned it knew the neighborhood, the routes, and how to move unseen. 2 uniformed officers interviewed Kim's children that morning at a relative's house. The older son, 16, described waking to a loud crash and his mother's scream. Through the half-open bedroom door, he saw 2 figures dressed in dark clothing, faces covered, dragging her toward the front entry. One of them spoke English with a rough accent. The other said something short in Vietnamese that the boy couldn't understand. Then they were gone. The younger sister, too small to comprehend, remembered only the smell of smoke and the sound of her mother calling her name. Detective Nguyen listened to the recordings of those interviews twice. When she reached the moment where the boy's voice cracked, she pressed pause. "We're not chasing amateurs," she said to her team. This was targeted. Forensics from the Tran home confirmed her suspicion. Footprints from 2 different boot sizes, both consistent with industrial workwear. Traces of ethanol near the doorway matched the accelerant used in the SUV fire. The prints led straight to the street but vanished beyond that point, suggesting the kidnappers had switched shoes or wiped them clean before entering the van. By late afternoon, the team received a tip from a tow truck operator who recalled pulling a damaged van from a drainage ditch 10 kilometers away 2 nights earlier. The report listed a broken rear light. The van had been claimed the same day by a man named Nguyen Tien Phat, a minor figure previously linked to a methamphetamine ring dismantled 2 years ago. Detective Nguyen recognized the name immediately. The victim's husband, Duy Tran, had once testified in a separate case that had put several of Phat's associates behind bars. A motive was beginning to form: revenge disguised as a random attack. That evening, Strike Force Bushfield traced phone pings near the abduction site. One device registered for 4 minutes at exactly 3:46 a.m., belonging to a prepaid number purchased under a false ID. When cross-referenced with tower data, the same phone appeared near the burn site at 4:04 a.m., then vanished. Investigators now had geography, timing, and the beginnings of a network. Detective Nguyen met with the Tran family again to explain the direction of the case. The husband sat motionless, eyes fixed on the table. When she mentioned the possibility that his past connections to witnesses in a drug trial might have triggered the attack, he covered his face and whispered, "I told her it was over. I thought it was finished." His words carried the weight of guilt more than shock. Outside reporters crowded the police, building their camera flashes reflecting off the glass doors. The story had evolved from tragedy to mystery. Was the Bankstown murder a revenge killing? Social media filled with speculation, strangers dissecting every photo of Kim Tran's smiling face, trying to match it to a narrative that made sense. Inside the lab, analysts recovered fragments of melted plastic from the SUV's back seat. Under magnification, they discovered the remnants of cable ties and a strip of duct tape fused to metal, evidence that Kim had been restrained before the fire. The brutality of it left seasoned investigators silent. Detective Nguyen wrote in her logbook, they wanted her to feel every moment. By the third night, Strikeforce Bushfield had mobilized more than 40 officers. Search warrants targeted known associates of Nguyen Tien Phat, while surveillance units watched every industrial lot between Bankstown and Cabramatta. In a city that prided itself on safety, fear began to spread quietly. Women double-checked locks, families installed cameras, and community forums overflowed with warnings written in 2 languages. Yet for all the manpower, progress remained fragile. The van was still missing, and Phat had vanished. At 1 a.m., Nguyen sat alone in the operations center. Lights dimmed the evidence board, glowing in pale blue from the monitors. The pattern was there: revenge, intimidation, silence, but proof still hovered just out of reach. She leaned back, rubbed her temples, and whispered the same phrase her Houston counterpart once had. She did everything right. She stayed home. She locked the door. It didn't matter. Outside the headquarters, Sydney's skyline shimmered in the distance. Somewhere in that sprawl, the people who had burned Kim Tran alive were still breathing free air, confident that fire could erase every trace of their crime. They were wrong. Strikeforce Bushfield was just getting started. By the 4th day of the investigation, Strikeforce Bushfield had become the beating heart of a city's grief. The temporary command post in Parramatta buzzed with the low hum of computers and radios, the smell of instant coffee and photocopied reports filling the air. Dozens of detectives, analysts, and forensic experts worked side by side, tracking fragments of evidence that might explain how an ordinary mother became the center of a professional hit. Detective Sergeant Alicia Nguyen pinned a new map to the wall, red string connecting Bankstown to Beverly Hills, then to a scrapyard outside Punchbowl. Everything leads through this triangle, she told her team. Whoever burned that car didn't just dump it. They were sending a message. Digital forensics was the first to strike gold. Analysts decrypted the prepaid phone recovered near the burn site, revealing a trail of deleted texts restored through data imaging. One message sent 2 hours before the murder read, "She won't talk again after tonight." Another included an address, Kim Tran's own street. The phone's origin traced back to a kiosk in Cabramatta, purchased with cash by a man wearing a baseball cap and face mask. The timestamp matched CCTV from the same location. When investigators enhanced the footage, they identified a tattoo peeking from under his sleeve, a dragon wrapped around a number 47. That number meant something. Task Force Intelligence flagged it as a known symbol linked to a small but violent syndicate operating in the area, often hired for debt collection and intimidation. They called themselves the 47 Crew, and among its core members was none other than Nguyen Tien Phat. Detective Nguyen leaned over the desk, staring at the tattoo photo. "We're not chasing ghosts anymore," she said quietly. "We're chasing soldiers." Meanwhile, another team examined Kim Tran's financials. Nothing suspicious, no debts, no hidden accounts. But her husband's name resurfaced again, tied to a property transfer from one of Phat's shell companies 3 years earlier. The transaction was small, buried in paperwork, but enough to suggest prior connection. The theory of mistaken identity faded. This was revenge retaliation for testimony that dismantled an entire supply chain years before. At 11 p.m., a warrant team raided a mechanic's workshop in Yaguna, connected to Phat's cousin. The workshop reeked of oil and gasoline, half the vehicles stripped for parts. In the corner, officers found a van missing its rear light. Forensics swabbed the steering wheel and gear shift. Partial DNA matched Kim Tran's blood type. Beneath the driver's seat lay a melted phone case and a half-empty container of ethanol. It was the confirmation they needed. The next morning, headlines blared, "Police close in on Bankstown murder suspects." Crowds gathered outside the Tran home again, leaving flowers and photographs. Kim's daughter watched from the window, small hands pressed to the glass. She asked her aunt, "Will they find the bad men?" The aunt answered softly, "They already have their names." Back at headquarters, Nguyen briefed the task force. "We have motive, vehicle, and partial DNA. Now we need people." Surveillance units spread through Sydney's southwest, monitoring known associates and tracing burner phones linked to the 47 Crew. Within 48 hours, they intercepted encrypted messages between Phat and another gang member discussing loose ends. Nguyen didn't sleep for 2 days. Her office became a collage of evidence, maps, receipts, photos of the Tran family before everything changed. She knew the case had already gone beyond simple justice. It had become symbolic, a promise to a frightened community that someone would answer for what happened. Late one night, her partner Detective Hall dropped a file on her desk. "You'll want to see this," he said. Inside were call records showing a contact saved as Boss K, a man whose voice had been captured during a prior narcotics sting. He was known for ordering torch jobs to send messages. "This isn't just revenge," Hall said. "It's business." Nguyen felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders. The murder of Kim Tran wasn't random cruelty, it was a warning to anyone who thought they could leave that life behind. But it had backfired. Instead of silence, it had ignited an investigation powerful enough to dismantle the very network that ordered it. By dawn, Strike Force Bushfield coordinated with federal agents to expand surveillance on the syndicate's financial channels. Forensic accountants traced money flowing from overseas accounts into local construction fronts. Every lead tightened the circle around Nguyen Tien Phat. In a small rented house on the outskirts of Bankstown, a young courier named Dewey Lay received a phone call instructing him to get rid of the files. Before he could leave, officers kicked down the door. On his laptop, they found documents naming every participant in the kidnapping, including the driver, the lookout, and the man who poured the fuel. Each name carried the same signature in Vietnamese, "Done for the debt." When Nguyen read those words, she didn't smile. She simply said, "Now we know who lit the match." The hunt for Phat was no longer about finding a suspect. It was about stopping an organization built on fear before another woman paid the same price. Sydney's criminal underworld is built on silence. In the weeks following the van's recovery, Strike Force Bushfield discovered how deep that silence ran. Every phone tap, every surveillance feed, every informant hint led back to the same name, Nguyen Tien Phat. But finding him was proving impossible. He'd gone underground, moving between safe houses scattered through the western suburbs, aided by a network of small-time enforcers who owed him loyalty and fear in equal measure. Detective Sergeant Alicia Nguyen gathered her core team inside the operations room. The whiteboard now looked less like a map and more like a web. Photos of faces connected by thin strings, mechanics' nightclub, bouncers, loan sharks, couriers. He's not hiding, she told them. He's being hidden. 2 days later, an unexpected lead arrived from an informant known only as Rico, a mid-level dealer desperate for leniency on his own charges. He claimed that Fat's crew had been paid to make an example out of Kim Tran, a message directed at her husband, who years earlier had provided information to the police during an operation that crippled the 47 crew's supply chain. They called her the insurance payment, Rico said. He couldn't be touched, so they took her instead. The statement reframed everything. What looked like a random act of cruelty was a calculated demonstration violence as currency. Rico also mentioned that Fat had been meeting someone he called the accountant, a clean-cut man who handled money transfers through construction companies and betting clubs. Detectives traced that nickname to Koa Lam, a financial fixer with a reputation for laundering millions through real estate fronts. If Koa Lam could be cornered, the rest of the operation would fall apart. Strike Force Bushfield coordinated a joint raid with federal agents on one of Lam's offices in Fairfield. They found him in the middle of shredding documents, his hands trembling as paper dust filled the air. Within hours, he was in custody, staring at the mirrored glass of the interrogation room. When Gwyn walked in, he didn't wait for questions. "I never touched her," he said, voice thin. "I just moved the money." Bit by bit, the story unfolded. The hit had been planned 6 weeks in advance, funded by overseas contacts tied to the methamphetamine network dismantled years earlier. Kim Tran's name had appeared on a list, one of several targets intended to send warnings to witnesses and families who had testified. The others had been relocated or disappeared quietly. She had stayed trusting that the law's promise of protection was real. Detective Nguyen pressed further. "Who gave the order?" she asked. Lam hesitated, then whispered, "Fat didn't act alone. There's someone above him. They call him the Doctor." The nickname meant nothing at first, but in criminal circles it carried weight. A handler who performed cleanups, removing people who threatened the flow of business. That night, Nguyen returned to headquarters and pinned a new name to the board, the Doctor, identity unknown. The board was almost full now, the web thick with color-coded lines. Every one of these men, she told her partner, thought she was disposable. "We'll prove she wasn't." Forensics confirmed the cash flow Lam described. Transfers from an account in Macau had been wired to a small trucking company in Yaguna 2 days before Kim's abduction. The same company owned the van used in the kidnapping. The trail of money was precise payment execution cleanup. It was the anatomy of murder rendered in numbers and timestamps. News outlets began to report on the breakthrough. Police identify international links in Bankstown murder. For the public, it was shocking. For Nguyen, it was personal. She had seen too many cases where victims became footnotes in the stories of men chasing power. Kim Tran's name would not be one of them. Still, frustration grew inside the task force. They had motive funding and the names of intermediaries, but not Fat himself. Intercepted calls hinted that he planned to flee the country using forged documents. Immigration alerts went out across airports and ports. Each hour felt borrowed. On February 28, just before midnight, Nguyen received an encrypted message from a contact in the Vietnamese community. "Fat is meeting someone in Lakemba. Small cafe after closing. Within minutes, unmarked cars surrounded the block. Officers watched through rain-spotted windows of their vehicles, though the night itself remained dry. The word rain had become shorthand among them for any storm about to break. Inside the cafe, two men sat in the dim light, one nervously checking his phone. When the door burst open, they froze. Fat ran toward the back alley, vaulting a fence, sprinting through narrow lanes. Nguyen chased on foot, her breath sharp in the cold air. A single shout, "Police stop," echoed through the dark. Seconds later, officers tackled him beside a stack of crates. Nguyen stood over him, hands on her knees, catching her breath. "It's over," she said. In his pocket, they found a passport with his photo under a false name and a plane ticket to Macau. On his forearm, the dragon tattoo glistened with sweat. The hunt that began with fire ended with restraint cuffs clicking closed. When Nguyen returned to headquarters, she removed the red circle around his name on the board. There were still others, the doctor among them, but for Kim Tran's family, the man who had orchestrated her death was finally behind bars. Justice hadn't yet arrived, but it was on its way. The arrest of Nguyen Tien Phat should have been the ending. But in homicide, endings are never clean. While the city exhaled, believing the monster had been caught, Detective Sergeant Alicia Nguyen knew too well that a man like Phat was only ever a middle link in a longer chain. His silence during interrogation confirmed it. Every question met the same answer: "I just follow orders." For 3 days he said nothing more. Then late, on the fourth night, he asked to speak privately. Under the dim light of the interview room, he stared at the wall, hands trembling slightly as he whispered, "You'll never touch the doctor. He's not in your country." It was a confession disguised as surrender, and it opened an entirely new war. Federal agents traced the offshore accounts Phat had used to move the payoff money. The trail led to Macau, then to a medical equipment import company that existed only on paper. Its registered director was Dr. Kai Min-le, a respected businessman, philanthropist, and according to Interpol, one of several suspected financiers of contract killings across Southeast Asia. The nickname made sense now. The doctor didn't heal people. He cleaned up their problems. Strike Force Bushfield assembled an emergency joint task force with international police. Emails recovered from Phat's encrypted drive detailed orders written in careful professional language. Client Tran neutralization complete. Proceed with disposal. Remuneration wired. The digital signature matched an account controlled by Kai Min-le's holding company. Detective Nguyen stood over the printed transcripts, her jaw tight. He paid for her life like he was ordering supplies. Her partner Hall nodded grimly. And he's still out there, untouchable behind borders. The Australian government filed extradition requests, while media outlets erupted. Headlines read, "Doctor of Death, the man behind Sydney's most brutal murder." Public fury boiled. Community leaders demanded reform, better witness protection, stronger penalties. Yet bureaucracy moved slower than outrage. The doctor remained in Macau, shielded by legal loopholes and influence that reached deep into business and politics. Inside the Tran household, the family followed every update on the evening news. The children watched quietly from the couch while their aunt whispered prayers. For them, justice felt like smoke, visible, unreachable, fading a little more each night. Meanwhile, Phat's resolve began to crumble. Facing a lifetime sentence, he offered cooperation in exchange for a reduced charge. He confessed that 6 men had been hired for the job, all paid through intermediaries connected to the 47 crew. His testimony exposed an entire lattice of criminal trade: drugs, money laundering, human trafficking. Kim Tran's death had been the cheapest operation they'd ever commissioned. Nguyen listened as he described the planning, the scouting of her house, the choice of the van, the order to make the death symbolic. They had chosen fire because it erased identity. When he finished, she said quietly, "Fire doesn't erase truth. It only exposes what's left behind." Her words became the closing line in the task force report. With Fat's cooperation, police raided more than a dozen properties across Sydney and Melbourne. They seized laptops, burner phones, and bank cards, linking directly to Kai Min Lei's company. Evidence poured in faster than prosecutors could catalog it. Within weeks, the Attorney General's office confirmed charges would be filed in absentia against the doctor for orchestrating the murder of Kim Tran. It was the first time in Australian history that a foreign national had been formally accused of directing a homicide on domestic soil through digital means. For Detective Nguyen, victory felt hollow. There would be no handcuffs on the mastermind, no courtroom confession, only paperwork and an empty chair where he should have stood. Still, she found solace in the faces of the families who gathered at the station steps when the announcement broke. They carried candles and framed photos, their voices rising together in Vietnamese and English, chanting Kim Tran's name like a promise. In her report, Nguyen wrote, "We found the doctor. We proved his reach. The rest is for time and governments to finish." When she signed her name, she paused and added one final sentence in the margin. She mattered. The case that began in darkness and fire ended in a courtroom filled with light television cameras, translators, and quiet applause as the guilty verdicts were read for those who had carried out the killing. Fat received a life sentence. His accomplices followed. The doctor remained free overseas, but his empire fractured, his accounts frozen, his name publicly condemned. As Nguyen left the courthouse, she looked up at the pale Sydney sky, its color washed to silver by morning haze. "It's never over," she murmured. Her partner asked, "Then what do we call this?" She replied, "A beginning." Because justice isn't a finish line, it's the moment someone refuses to stop running toward it. The courtroom was packed to capacity when the verdict for Nguyen Tien Phat was read. Reporters filled the aisles, their cameras poised, waiting for the sound that always comes when justice is spoken aloud, the collective exhale of a room that has been holding its breath. The judge's voice was steady, guilty of murder in the first degree. No one cheered. There was no triumph, only silence heavy enough to feel like gravity. Kim Tran's family sat in the front row. Her son stared at the floor, hands clenched around a folded photograph. Her daughter leaned into her aunt's shoulder, too young to understand the ceremony of justice, but old enough to feel its chill. When the sentence followed life imprisonment without parole, the boy whispered, "Does that mean it's over?" His aunt shook her head. "Not yet," she said, "not until she can rest." Outside the courthouse, the crowd waited behind police barriers, holding candles and signs printed with Kim's smiling face. Some carried lilies, others handmade posters, reading "No More Silence." As the detectives exited, applause rose softly, less for victory than for endurance. Detective Sergeant Alicia Nguyen met the family briefly, offering a quiet bow. The husband looked at her and said, "She didn't deserve to die like that." Nguyen replied, "No one ever does." The trial lasted nearly 6 months, its testimony exposing every shadow of Sydney's underworld. Jurors heard about the overseas payments, the coded messages, and the cold efficiency of the 47 crew. They saw the photos, Kim's burned vehicle, the ash-stained street, the remnants of a life extinguished. Prosecutors described how fear had been used as currency, how revenge had become business. By the end, even hardened reporters wiped their eyes. Phat never apologized. He refused to speak at sentencing, choosing instead to stare blankly at the wall. But when the judge detailed the brutality of the crime, he flinched for the first time. It wasn't remorse, it was recognition. The court declared his actions inhuman, deliberate, and beyond comprehension. Kim Tran's funeral was held in the same temple where she used to volunteer on weekends. Incense curled through the air, the faint chime of bells echoing beneath the roof. Hundreds attended, not all of them knew her, but all of them knew what she represented. A woman who trusted the promise of safety in a world that failed to keep it. Her coffin was covered with white orchids and a single framed photo taken during her last family holiday. The inscription beneath read, "She loved deeply, lived honestly, and left too soon." Weeks later, Detective Nguyen received an email from Kim's daughter. The message was short: "Thank you for believing my mother mattered." Nguyen printed it and pinned it beside her desk next to a photo from her first day on the force. It reminded her why she had joined in the first place, to give a voice to the people who could no longer speak. But even as one case closed, another began to stir. Halfway across the world, in a small Vietnamese province near Dien Bien Phu, another young woman would vanish in circumstances eerily similar. Ordinary day, familiar faces, impossible disappearance. The cycle was starting again. On her last night before leave, Nguyen stood outside the police building, breathing the warm evening air. The lights of Sydney glowed in the distance, scattered across the skyline like sparks from a dying flame. For every answer, she whispered, "There's another question waiting somewhere else." In Vietnam, those questions had already begun. A university student named Du Yen had been delivering chickens to a family friend for the Lunar New Year festival. She left home laughing, promised to return by dinner, and never came back. By nightfall, her mother would be searching the streets with a flashlight, calling her name into the dark. Back in Sydney, Nguyen opened her phone and scrolled through the latest crime alerts out of habit. One headline caught her eye: "Student disappears in northern Vietnam under mysterious circumstances." She read it twice, feeling the familiar weight settle on her chest. Different country, same story. She closed the phone, whispering the words she always said when a new case found her. Another name, another silence. Because evil doesn't retire, it relocates. And sometimes, while one story ends in fire, another begins under the dim glow of a single streetlight halfway across the world. On the morning of February 4th, 2019, the first day of the Lunar New Year, Dien Bien Phu was alive with color. Red lanterns swayed from every shopfront, incense burned at the doors of family homes, and the scent of sticky rice and roasted chicken drifted through the air. Amid the festival noise, 22-year-old Dung Thi Duyen balanced a large basket of poultry on her motorbike and tied the last knot on the cord. She smiled at her father, who stood in the doorway holding a bag of vegetables. "I'll be back before lunch," she said. He nodded, unaware that those would be the last words he would ever hear from her. Duyen was a student at Dien Bien College of Education, known around town for her optimism. She was the kind of person who laughed too loud, who shared her food with classmates, who called her mother twice a day just to check in. That morning, she had promised to deliver 10 chickens to a family friend as a favor to her mother, then return home to help prepare the ancestral altar. It was a short trip, less than 5 kilometers, through quiet rural roads she had traveled hundreds of times before. When she rode away from her house, the sun was still low, turning the fields gold. Neighbors waved. A vendor shouted good luck for the new year. Nothing about the scene suggested danger. It was by all appearances an ordinary morning. But somewhere along that narrow dirt road, lined with bamboo, something extraordinary and horrifying happened. By early afternoon, when she hadn't returned, her parents began calling. No answer. Her phone rang once, then went silent. They assumed she had stopped at a friend's house for lunch. Evening came. The markets closed. The city lights flickered on. Still no sign of her. When her mother called again near midnight and the line went straight to voicemail, panic replaced patience. At dawn the next day, the family reported her missing to local police. Officers followed the road she had taken, their boots sinking into soft red mud left by the morning fog. 2 kilometers from her destination, they found her motorbike parked beside a rice field, upright key still in the ignition. The chickens were gone, so was Du Yen. The discovery shook the small community to its core. Dien Bien Phu was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where news traveled faster than sirens. People gathered near the site, whispering prayers, offering theories. Some said she had been robbed, others thought she might have run away. Her parents rejected both ideas immediately. She was coming home to eat, her mother insisted. She wouldn't just vanish. Detective Colonel Tren Quoc Hoang from the provincial police took charge of the investigation. He ordered drones to survey the area, tracking tire marks, footprints, and any sign of struggle. The dirt around the bike showed multiple prints, some overlapping, others dragging toward a thicket of sugarcane. Search dogs were brought in, their handlers moving methodically through the rows until one barked sharply near a ditch. Inside, they found a small pink helmet smeared with mud. Forensics collected fibers from the lining and confirmed they matched the victim's clothing. The trail led toward a cluster of abandoned huts, once used for storing tools during harvest season. When officers forced open the first door, they found blood on the floorboards and the faint smell of gasoline. The second hut was empty, except for rope, plastic sheets, and cigarette butts. It was clear now this wasn't a random crime. It was an ambush. Back at the station, detectives pieced together the timeline. The last phone signal from Du Yen's device was logged at 10:27 a.m., pinging from a tower near the sugarcane field. After that, nothing. The phone had been switched off manually. Her social media accounts showed no activity, and friends confirmed she had no conflicts, no debts, no secret relationships. The sheer lack of motive made the case even more bewildering. As news spread, volunteers poured in from surrounding villages to search rivers, forests, and abandoned wells. Television crews arrived, filming tearful interviews with family members. The case dominated national headlines: college student missing during Lunar New Year delivery. The story struck a chord across Vietnam. An ordinary girl, a holiday of joy, turned into mourning, a disappearance in broad daylight on a road everyone knew. For days the search turned up nothing. The fields grew quiet again. Lanterns from Tet celebrations still hung along the fences, their red paper faded and curling in the humidity. Each one swayed gently in the evening wind, a cruel reminder that the festival meant to honor ancestors had now become a vigil for someone still living. When a week passed with no results, locals began to lose hope. Then on the 9th day, a farmer walking his cow through a clearing caught sight of something unusual. Near a small stream, a blue jacket caught on a branch. He called police immediately. Within hours, the site was sealed off. The jacket matched Du Yen's description exactly, and just beyond it, in a shallow depression covered by leaves, officers found what they had feared most. The missing student had finally been found. But what investigators discovered around her would open the door to a mystery darker than anyone imagined. The discovery of Du Yen's body shattered the fragile calm that had held Dien Bien together since her disappearance. Within hours, the once quiet village became a scene of controlled chaos. Investigators, journalists, and mourners converging on the sugarcane field that now looked less like farmland and more like a battlefield of grief. Yellow police tape fluttered between trees while villagers stood behind it, whispering prayers under their breath. Detective Colonel Trun Kwok Hoang crouched near the shallow grave, gloved hands steady. The scene was meticulous in its cruelty. The victim's body was partially covered by leaves, her clothes torn, her skin bearing bruises and ligature marks. Forensics recorded every detail in silence. Among the debris they collected were 2 cigarette brands, strands of coarse hair, and footprints leading toward the tree line where a motorcycle had once stopped. Whoever committed the crime had taken care to erase traces, but not enough. By evening, as the coroner's van pulled away, hundreds of villagers lined the road, heads bowed. The procession passed in complete silence, interrupted only by the low hum of the vehicle's engine. Duyen's mother collapsed to her knees when the van turned the corner out of sight. Her father held her shoulders, his face locked in the blank expression of a man who had run out of tears. The autopsy results confirmed what everyone already feared: the young woman had been assaulted and strangled before being buried. The brutality was methodical. The medical examiner estimated she had died within hours of leaving home, placing the time of death close to 11 a.m. Her phone was never recovered. Detective Hoang knew immediately this was no random act of violence. Too much planning, too little chaos. Someone had been waiting for her, but why? The day after the discovery, national television aired live coverage from the village temple where the funeral rites began. People from across the province traveled to attend. Banners of mourning hung between bamboo poles, the sound of chanting monks filling the air. Rows of students from her college arrived in uniform, holding candles and portraits of their classmate. They placed her textbooks beside the coffin, each one marked with her neat handwriting. The entire country seemed to stop and watch. For many, Duyen became a symbol, the daughter everyone felt they had lost, the friend they wished they had protected. Social media filled with messages demanding justice. Her name trended for days under a single phrase that would define the case: justice for the girl who delivered chickens. At the police headquarters, pressure mounted. Detectives worked around the clock, tracing the route from her home to the field, interrogating locals, and combing through surveillance footage from nearby shops. They interviewed more than 100 witnesses, but none could identify a suspect. Then a small lead emerged. A shopkeeper remembered a man buying rope and plastic sheeting the day before the disappearance. He had driven a white truck with a dented side panel. The description matched a vehicle owned by a local drifter named Vung Van Hoong, a man with a history of petty theft and burglary. Hoang ordered immediate surveillance on Hoong's residence. The suspect lived in a small, cluttered rental house near the edge of town. When officers arrived, the front gate was unlocked. Inside, they found a pair of muddy shoes that matched the prints from the sugarcane field, and a knife stained with what appeared to be blood. In the kitchen freezer sat several chicken carcasses wrapped in newspaper, possibly from the delivery Duyen was supposed to make. The discovery turned suspicion into certainty. Hoong was arrested without resistance. His demeanor was eerily calm, almost relieved. During the first round of questioning, he claimed Duyen had agreed to sell him the chickens privately, that her death was an accident during a struggle. When pressed, his story changed twice within an hour. The inconsistencies multiplied, but something about his confession bothered Hoang. It was too neat, too practiced, as if he were repeating lines he'd been told to say. Word of the arrest spread quickly, but instead of relief, it sparked unease. Locals whispered that Hoong wasn't smart enough to plan something this elaborate. Theories began to swirl, that others were involved, that the crime was ordered by someone with more power, someone the suspect was too afraid to name. At the funeral, as incense smoke curled through the temple air, Duyen's best friend Mai knelt beside the coffin, whispering through tears, "You always said you weren't afraid of anything." I wish I'd known what you were walking into." Around her, the sound of morning rose, the sharp rhythm of wooden gongs, the chanting of monks, the sobs of parents who couldn't let go. Outside reporters broadcast live updates. "A suspect has been arrested," they said. "Police believe the case will soon be solved." But inside the temple, no one believed it was over. The feeling in the air was too heavy, the pattern too familiar. Detective Hong left the funeral early to review the suspect's interrogation tapes. As he watched the man's eyes shift away from the camera each time the name accomplice was mentioned, the detective wrote a single line in his notebook. "He's protecting someone." That night, as the town fell quiet, the lights in the police station burned long past midnight. The first arrest had been made, but in Dien Bien, justice was still buried beneath too many layers of fear and silence. The arrest of Vung Van Hung brought Dien Bien to a standstill. For days, the entire province buzzed with speculation. Television anchors called him the chicken killer. Newspapers ran his photo beside Du Yen's graduation portrait, and online commentators declared the case solved. But inside the provincial police headquarters, Detective Colonel Chun Kwok Wang wasn't convinced. Hung sat in a small interrogation room, his wrists cuffed loosely to the table. The camera recorded his every blink. He was 35, gaunt, with restless eyes that darted between the officers. When asked why he killed her, he shrugged. "She wouldn't stop screaming," he said in a flat tone. Then, as if correcting himself, added, "It wasn't supposed to happen." At first the story seemed plausible. He claimed he had planned to rob her, panicked when she resisted and accidentally strangled her. But as Hoang reviewed the physical evidence, the gaps widened. The rope fibers found on the victim didn't match the type discovered in Hung's home. The knots were professional, tight, symmetrical, and deliberate. Hung's criminal record showed no history of violence, only petty theft. He lacked the skill and composure to execute something so organized. When pressed on the location of the assault, he faltered. "In the hut," he said. Then moments later, by the field, his timeline changed with every session. Forensics confirmed he had been in the area, but phone records placed him miles away at the time she vanished. His confession unraveled faster than it was written. Detective Huang watched him carefully. The man's eyes twitched whenever certain questions arose, specifically those about who helped him move the body. "No one," Hung said each time. But his body language betrayed him. The detective wrote a note to his team. "He's covering for someone higher." After 3 days of interrogation, Hung finally broke. It wasn't guilt that cracked him, it was exhaustion. "They told me to do it," he muttered, head bowed. "I didn't even know her name." Huang leaned forward. "Who told you?" Hung stared at the table. "I can't say. They'll kill my family." That sentence changed everything. Police secured a new warrant to search Hung's relatives' properties. In his cousin's garage, they found a box of prepaid SIM cards and a notebook filled with numbers, each labeled with initials. One entry stood out: TK. Payment confirmed. Investigators traced one of those numbers to a second suspect, a local trader with ties to a larger drug trafficking network that had long operated along the Lao border. Suddenly the picture began to sharpen. Du Yen's death was no longer an isolated tragedy. It was the byproduct of a criminal web that reached far beyond Dien Bien. Reports surfaced of similar disappearances, women who had been lured under false pretenses and never returned. When questioned again, Hung refused to elaborate. He sat in silence, hands trembling, eyes wet with something between fear and shame. "I was promised money," he whispered. "I didn't think they'd actually bury her." At the same time, investigators examined security footage from nearby petrol stations. One camera captured a white truck, Hung's driving behind another vehicle carrying 2 passengers. The second truck belonged to a woman named Bui Kim Thu, a known associate of several narcotics traffickers in the province. Police quickly identified her as a potential accomplice. When officers arrived at Thu's house, they found her standing calmly in the yard smoking a cigarette. "You've been expecting us," one officer said. She smiled faintly. "Everyone knew you'd come," she replied. Inside her home, investigators found a plastic bag containing blood-stained clothing and a pair of gloves identical to those recovered near the sugarcane field. Thu's arrest opened floodgates. Within days, 4 more suspects were taken into custody, each connected by phone calls, money transfers, and whispered orders. The most shocking revelation came when one of them confessed that the crime had been arranged by a relative of Du Yan's, a woman who had owed a significant debt to a drug dealer and had offered her own niece as collateral in exchange for Du Yan's leniency. When Detective Hoang read that confession, he set his pen down and closed his eyes. The case that had begun as a robbery had become something far more grotesque, a conspiracy that blurred the line between betrayal and survival. Public reaction was immediate and furious. The idea that a family member could orchestrate such a crime against her own blood sent ripples of disbelief through the nation. Social media erupted with anger. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, holding photos of Du Yan and chanting for the death penalty. In the interrogation room, Hung sat quietly as the headlines played on the small television bolted to the wall. When the anchor read the words, "Family betrayal confirmed," he turned away, muttering to himself, "I told you it wasn't just me." Detective Hoang stood in the observation booth watching through the glass. He had solved cases before: murders, kidnappings, smuggling rings, but never one that felt this personal. He thought of the girl's mother lighting incense at the funeral of the father, who still waited by the gate each evening, as if she might come home. The truth was emerging, but each revelation only deepened the tragedy. The first arrest had given them a name. The next would expose a network. And before long the world would learn that Du Yan's death wasn't the act of a monster, it was the work of many ordinary people, each playing a part in something monstrous. By the end of February, the investigation into Du Yan's murder had grown beyond anything the provincial police could have imagined. What began as a single suspect in a small rural town had exploded into a multi-layered criminal network spanning 4 provinces. The deeper detectives dug, the clearer it became that her death was the result of something systematic, a web woven from greed, addiction, and fear. Detective Colonel Chen Kuok-Huang stood before a new map in the command room. Red pins marked every known connection: safe houses, drug routes, and names of people who had once seemed ordinary: shopkeepers, drivers, a retired officer, even a former teacher. All linked by one thing: money. He circled the name at the center of it all: Bui Van Kong. Kong was a truck driver who worked part-time hauling construction materials across the northern border. On paper, he was an unremarkable man in his 40s, married with 2 children. But phone records painted a darker picture. In the weeks leading up to Du Yan's disappearance, Kong's phone had been in constant contact with several of the arrested suspects, including Vung Van Hung and Bui Kim Thursday. Text between them referenced the job, the cargo, and a chilling phrase repeated 3 times: "Make sure she doesn't come back." Hoang gathered his team. "This isn't a crime of passion," he said. "It's logistics. They planned her death like a shipment." The search of Kong's property revealed evidence that made even veteran officers fall silent. In the back of his truck, forensic technicians found traces of blood that matched Du Yan's DNA. Hidden beneath a tarp, they discovered handcuffs, electrical cords, and a roll of industrial plastic identical to what had been used to wrap the victim's body. A ledger under the driver's seat listed payments, small amounts transferred to 5 individuals, each corresponding to the suspects already in custody. When confronted, Kong denied everything. "I'm just a driver," he said. "I don't know what they did." But as investigators pressed harder, his wife, under separate questioning, admitted that he had come home the night of the disappearance shaking and smelling like metal. She claimed he had told her something went wrong before locking himself in the bathroom for an hour. It was enough to bring him in. The arrest shocked the community again. People had known Kung as a friendly neighbor who fixed their trucks and attended local festivals. The idea that he could lead a murder plot felt impossible. Yet as the evidence stacked up, the line between ordinary and evil blurred until it vanished completely. Forensic analysis of the suspect's phone revealed even more. The night after the murder, he had taken several photos on his device, dark, grainy images of the sugarcane field and the dirt road leading to it. Embedded in the metadata was a timestamp, February 4th, 11:56 a.m., the estimated time of Duyen's death. When investigators showed him the photos, he stared at the table and whispered, "I didn't mean for her to die." But his expression was cold, detached. Huang noted in his report, no sign of remorse, only inconvenience. The motive that emerged was both simple and horrifying. Kong and his associates were deep in debt to a local drug distributor who had supplied them on credit. When the debt came due, they were told to deliver something valuable. According to one confession, that something was a person. Duyen had become collateral, a payment made in flesh. The case spiraled outward from there. Police uncovered a chain of transactions connecting the group to traffickers across the border, some of whom had previously been implicated in abductions. They discovered that Duyen had been targeted because her aunt, desperate to erase her own debt, had revealed her routine, her route, her schedule, and her vulnerability. She hadn't expected it to end in death. When confronted with this revelation, the aunt confessed, sobbing, that she thought they only wanted to scare the girl. The officers who took her statement couldn't look her in the eye. The betrayal was too much to process. By the time the arrests were complete, 8 people had been charged, each playing a role: the scout, the driver, the enforcer, the lookout, the informant, and the woman who provided access to the victim. Together, they formed a human machine built for cruelty. The trial preparations began immediately. Crowds filled the courthouse steps day after day, holding signs that read, "Justice for Duyen." The government promised transparency, but the public's anger was beyond control. It wasn't just the horror of the crime, it was the realization that an entire community had been complicit through silence. At home, Duyen's parents sat in front of the family altar each evening, lighting candles beside her photo. The once bright house felt hollow, now its walls covered in news clippings and official documents. Her mother kept a single item from the case file: the ribbon from the basket of chickens folded neatly in a glass box. Detective Hoang stayed late most nights writing his final report. "We caught the ones who did it," he wrote, "but we haven't yet caught what made them capable of it. It was more than a crime. It was a mirror held up to a system of desperation." As the trial date drew near, he knew what would come next. The verdicts would be harsh, the nation would watch. And when it ended, the headlines would fade, leaving behind another story of justice that arrived too late to save the innocent. When the truth about Duyen's aunt emerged, even the most hardened investigators struggled to process it. What they had uncovered wasn't just a crime, it was a betrayal that reached into the heart of family itself. In a small gray interview room, lit only by a single fluorescent bulb, The woman who had once been trusted as a second mother sat hunched over the table, hands trembling. Her name was Trun Thi Hien, 43 years old, a mother of two known in the community for her cheerful greetings and generous cooking. She had been the one to introduce Du Yan's family to the man who later ordered the killing. Detective Colonel Trun Quoc Hoang sat across from her, expression neutral. Between them lay a single document, the confession statement she had just signed. Her voice was barely audible when she spoke. "I didn't mean for her to die," she whispered. "They promised they wouldn't hurt her. They just wanted to scare me." But the evidence told a different story. Bank records showed multiple transfers from Hien's account to one belonging to Bui Vun Kong, the ringleader. Phone logs revealed dozens of calls exchanged in the days before Du Yan's disappearance. And surveillance footage placed her at a roadside stall just hours before the abduction, speaking to one of the men later arrested. When confronted, she admitted that she had given them her niece's schedule and described what she would be wearing that morning. The motive was pitifully human debt. She owed more than 200 million dong to drug traffickers who had threatened her children. They told her to deliver something valuable. In her desperation, she convinced herself it would only be intimidation, a warning staged to buy time. She had no idea, or perhaps refused to believe, that the warning would end in murder. As she recounted the events, her voice cracked. "She called me that morning," she said through tears. "She told me she was on her way with the chickens. I told her to be careful on the road. I said, 'Don't stop for strangers.' Then she buried her face in her hands and sobbed until her shoulders shook." The revelation tore through the nation like wildfire. Newspapers ran front-page headlines, "Aunt sold niece to pay debt." Commentators called it the most heartless crime in modern Vietnam. The case had already horrified the public, but this detail transformed it into a national reckoning. At the provincial police headquarters, officers gathered in silence as Hoang briefed them. "This is what greed and fear look like when they destroy everything decent," he said. "We are not chasing monsters. We are chasing people who lost their humanity by inches." During a reconstruction of the crime, investigators confirmed that Hien had arranged for Du Yan to deliver chickens to a customer she knew didn't exist. That false delivery was the bait. The rest, the kidnapping, the assault, the burial, unfolded according to a plan written by men who saw life as a commodity. Public outrage became a roar. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered day and night, holding candles, chanting prayers, demanding death sentences. Television anchors spoke with trembling voices. In a land that reveres family, one said a niece was betrayed by the very person meant to protect her. Inside her cell, Hien stopped eating. When guards checked on her, she stared at the wall, murmuring to herself, "I just wanted to save my children." There was no redemption in her tone, only disbelief at what she had become. Du Yan's parents refused to attend her sister's hearings. "She's already dead to us," her father told reporters. "We buried 2 daughters, one in the ground, one in our hearts." His words echoed across the country, printed in bold across every newspaper column. Detective Hoang returned to the case file one final time before trial. The evidence was overwhelming: text messages, financial transfers, eyewitness testimony. He wrote his summary in quiet disbelief. Greed created opportunity. Fear provided motive. Family supplied access. The victim trusted every person who killed her. When the trial began, cameras lined the courtroom. The defendants, 8 in total, stood in a single row behind the glass partition. Hung Kong and Thu looked blank. Hien trembled visibly. The prosecutor read out the charges: murder, kidnapping, assault, and involvement in narcotics. Each name was followed by the same phrase: punishable by death. Throughout the proceedings, the nation watched. Each night, families gathered around televisions, unable to look away. The story was no longer about one girl. It was about what happens when desperation rots the soul of a family, when poverty and fear conspire to erase conscience. After the closing arguments, the judge addressed the court. The victim was innocent, blameless, and betrayed. No punishment can restore what was lost, but punishment must remind us of what must never be repeated. When the verdicts were announced, 7 death sentences, 1 life imprisonment, the crowd outside erupted in applause and tears. The nation had its justice, but the victory felt hollow. Nothing could bring back the bright, laughing student who had ridden down that road with a basket of chickens and faith in the world's goodness. That night, Huang drove past the sugarcane field one last time. The stalks had regrown tall and rustling in the breeze, hiding the ground that once held so much horror. He stopped the car, turned off the engine, and listened. The night was quiet now, too quiet, he whispered. We found them all, but it still feels unfinished. Some wounds never close. They only stop bleeding long enough for new ones to begin. The trial of 8 defendants in the Dien Bien murder case became one of the most closely watched court proceedings in Vietnam's history. Every seat in the courtroom was filled, every corner lined with reporters. Outside, loudspeakers broadcast each session, live to the crowds gathered beyond the barricades. There had been sensational cases before, but none had pierced the country's conscience like this one. Inside, the air was heavy with incense, from offerings placed by Duyen's classmates before the hearing began. The defendants stood behind a glass partition, 8 figures, motionless eyes fixed on the floor. In front of them sat rows of victims' family members clutching photos of the young woman they had lost. The sound of the judge's gavel silenced even the murmurs from the street. The prosecution presented its case with precision. They detailed how the plan had formed weeks before Lunar New Year, how Bui Van Kong and Vuan Van Hung had plotted the abduction, how Bui Kim Thu had helped lure the victim, and how Trun Thi Hien's desperate debt had set the plan in motion. Each role was laid bare, each action chained to the next, until the entire mechanism of cruelty stood exposed. When the state prosecutor displayed the final piece of evidence, a series of text messages between Kong and his suppliers, instructing them to collect payment immediately, the courtroom fell silent. The words were brief, businesslike, and devastating. To those men, a human life had been reduced to a transaction. The defense tried to shift blame, arguing coercion, addiction, and fear. They described their clients as victims of circumstance, pawns in a larger system of poverty and exploitation. But the judge's face did not change. Poverty explains nothing, he said quietly. It does not excuse cruelty. The testimony that followed broke even seasoned journalists. Witnesses described how the suspects had argued over what to do when Duyen fought back, how one ordered another to finish it quickly. A forensic expert explained the exact sequence of events leading to her death, his voice trembling only once when he said her name. The room stayed silent, except for the scratch of pens taking notes and the occasional gasp from the gallery. Detective Colonel Trun Quoc Huang sat near the back, watching it all unfold. He had been in courtrooms before, had seen murderers weep and deny and repent, but never had he seen a group so numb. They were shells drained of remorse, of humanity. He realized then that the true mastermind wasn't a single person. It was the system itself, a culture of desperation that turned debt into weapon and fear into currency. After 10 days of testimony, the judge announced recess before delivering the verdict. That evening, television anchors discussed the case like a national confession. This is more than a crime, one commentator said. It's a mirror showing what happens when greed, fear, and silence combine. On the final day, the courtroom was overflowing. The crowd outside stretched for blocks, holding candles despite the daylight. When the defendants were brought in chains, clinking softly, all 8 kept their heads down. The verdict took nearly 20 minutes to read. Defendant Bui Van Kong death. Defendant Vung Van Hung death. Defendant Bui Kim Tu death. Defendant Chun Ti Hien death. 4 others death. 1 accomplice life imprisonment. The words echoed off the walls like a slow drumbeat. Some in the audience wept, others nodded grimly. Duyen's father covered his face with both hands. Her mother collapsed into the arms of a relative. Justice had arrived, but it did not heal. After the sentencing, reporters crowded around Detective Hoang as he left the courthouse. One asked, "Do you believe justice was done?" He paused, looking out at the sea of candles flickering beyond the police barrier. Justice, he said, was the least we could give her. But it came far too late. That night across Vietnam, thousands of candles burned in windows and on sidewalks. In Hanoi, students organized vigils in her memory. In Saigon, monks recited prayers for victims of violence. Even in Dien Bien itself, where the fields had long returned to quiet, lanterns floated down the river in a procession of light that stretched far into the dark. In his final report to the Ministry of Public Security, Hoang summarized the entire case in one line. 8 people conspired to end 1 life, and an entire nation watched to remember what happens when compassion dies. He closed the file, knowing it would be studied by cadets and scholars for decades. The next morning he drove past the sugar-cane field again. Sunlight cut through the mist, turning the stalks gold. For the first time he stopped his car and stepped out. Birds called from the trees. Somewhere nearby a farmer's radio played faint folk music. He stood still, listening to the hum of life, reclaiming the place where death once reigned. "Rest now," he whispered. "They can't touch you anymore." He stayed until the sun was fully up, then returned to his car and drove away. Behind him the field swayed in the wind like a sea of green forgiveness, closing over the memory of violence, but never erasing it. The sentences of death were supposed to bring closure, but in Dien Bien closure was an illusion. The trials ended, the cameras left, and yet the silence that followed felt heavier than the weeks of shouting and grief that came before. For the first time in months, the courthouse stood empty, its doors locked, the courtyard littered with wilted flowers left by mourners. Justice had spoken, but healing was nowhere to be found. In the weeks after the verdict, newspapers printed retrospectives. Each headline carried Duyen's name alongside a single haunting phrase, a lesson for every family. Commentators praised the police, condemned the cruelty, and questioned how such evil could exist in a place that still celebrated its community festivals with lanterns and laughter. But in private, the people of Dien Bien lowered their voices when they spoke about it. The story was too close, too raw. Every family saw a piece of themselves somewhere inside it, debt, fear, silence. Detective Colonel Trun Quoc Hoang received commendations from the ministry for solving one of the most complex murder cases in national history. He accepted them without ceremony. At the small gathering held in Hanoi, he said only no medal replaces a life. Those who heard him remembered that line more than any speech given that day. Meanwhile, preparations began for the executions. The condemned were transferred to separate detention facilities. Rumors spread that some had cried, others had remained silent. Tren Thi Hien, the aunt whose debt had started everything, reportedly asked to see her sister one last time, but the family refused. "You already said goodbye the day you gave her name away," her brother-in-law told the warden. When the executions were carried out, there were no public announcements. In Vietnam, such matters are private, witnessed only by officials and recorded in silence. The following morning, families of the victims received brief notices, confirming that the sentences had been completed. Duyan's father read the document and placed it under her photo on the family altar. "It's done," he whispered, though his voice broke halfway through the words. In schools across the country, teachers discussed the case during ethics lessons. Students watched documentaries and held moments of silence. For a new generation, Duyan's story became more than a crime. It was a cautionary tale about the fragility of trust and the darkness that can grow from debt and desperation. Detective Hoang returned to Dien Bien a month later to deliver a report to local authorities. As he drove past the sugarcane field, he noticed something new, a small stone shrine built by villagers at the edge of the road. It bore her name and a single inscription for the girl who trusted the wrong people. Offerings of fruit and incense surrounded it, replaced daily by locals who had never met her but felt compelled to honor her memory. He parked nearby and walked toward the shrine, leaving a stick of incense. The smoke curled upward, thin and silver against the sky. "You became more than a victim," he said softly. "You became a warning that will outlive us all." Before leaving, he met Duyan's parents one last time. Their house, once full of laughter, had grown quiet. Her mother served tea, her hands shaking slightly. "People still come to visit," she said. "They bring flowers, ask questions. Sometimes I tell them everything. Sometimes I tell them nothing." Her husband added, "We don't hate them anymore. Hatred doesn't build anything." Outside, children played along the dirt road, their laughter echoing through the fields. For a moment, it sounded like a song, a reminder that life, however fragile, insists on returning. When Hoang drove away, he saw the reflection of the shrine in his rearview mirror growing smaller until it disappeared behind a bend. On the seat beside him lay the final report, stamped and signed. The last line read, "Case closed. Justice delivered." But as he read it aloud, the words felt hollow. Justice may have been delivered, but peace never arrived. In the capital, the story of Dien Bien slowly faded from the news cycle. New crimes replaced old headlines. Yet across Vietnam, every time a daughter left home alone, every time a woman didn't return on time, someone would whisper her name. "Be careful," they'd say. "Remember what happened to the girl with the chickens." It was in that whispered warning that Duyan lived on, not as tragedy, but as memory carved into the conscience of a nation, still learning what it means to protect its own. Half a world away in Brazil, another young woman was preparing for a photo shoot, unaware that her own story would soon follow the same path, from beauty to obsession, from trust to betrayal. Months after the final executions, Dien Bien Phu returned to its rhythm markets, opening at dawn, farmers tending the fields, motorbikes weaving through narrow streets. Yet something intangible lingered in the air, a quiet awareness that this place would never again be just another provincial town. Every road sign, every corner of the market seemed to carry a whisper of the girl whose death had changed everything. Detective Colonel Trun Quoc Hoang officially retired that spring. His superiors offered him a commendation ceremony in Hanoi, but he declined. "The work is finished," he told them. "No speeches can make it right." Instead, he spent his last day at the precinct cleaning out his desk, a stack of case files, a half-empty thermos of green tea, and one framed photograph of Duyan, taken from a local newspaper. He wrapped the frame in newspaper and placed it gently in a box. That evening he walked home along the same dirt road that led past the sugarcane field. The crops had grown tall again, their rustling leaves hiding the ground that once held so much pain. As he passed, he thought of how time has a way of softening even the sharpest horrors but never erasing them. The field looked ordinary now, but beneath its soil lay the history of a nation's outrage and a family's eternal grief. At the edge of the road stood the small stone shrine villagers had built. Incense smoke rose from the altar, twisting upward into the pale blue sky. Huang stopped, bowed his head, and whispered a prayer he hadn't said in years. "May she forgive us," he murmured, "for not hearing her in time." He stayed there for a while, watching a group of children run past, their laughter echoing down the road. One of them pointed at the shrine and asked what it was. Another replied, "That's where the girl sleeps." Their voices faded into the distance, leaving behind an ache that felt almost sacred. In the months that followed, the case continued to ripple outward. Universities studied it, psychologists wrote papers about moral decay and social pressure, and lawmakers debated reforms to protect women in rural areas. Yet for the people of Dien Bien, the legacy was simpler. They checked on their neighbors more often. They walked each other home after dark. The case had transformed fear into vigilance. Duyen's parents still lived in the same small house with faded green shutters. Her room remained untouched. Textbooks lined the shelf. Her favorite blouse hung neatly in the closet, and a small stuffed bear sat on her pillow. Each evening, her mother lit a candle and spoke softly to the photo on the dresser. "You can rest now, Kangai. People remember your name." Sometimes on quiet nights, Huang would sit on his porch, listening to the faint hum of cicadas and the distant barking of dogs. He thought about how many cases he had solved, how many criminals he had brought to justice, and how few of those victories felt like peace. The Duyen case had taught him something uncomfortable, that justice can punish the guilty but never fully protect the innocent. When asked by a young officer why the case had affected him so deeply, he replied, "Because she trusted everyone who killed her. And that kind of faith is what keeps the world running even when it shouldn't." As summer drew near, he prepared to leave Dien Bien for good. He packed light, a few clothes, his old police badge, and the photo of the smiling student whose story had followed him into his dreams. On his final night, he returned once more to the shrine. The sunset bathed the sugarcane in gold, the same color as the morning she disappeared. He placed the photo at the base of the stone and whispered, "You changed this place more than any law ever could." Then he turned and walked away without looking back. Far across the world, in another hemisphere, a different story was beginning. This one not in a quiet farming village, but in the neon pulse of Manaus, Brazil. There, a young beauty queen named Kimberly Karen Moda would soon discover that admiration can turn to obsession, and that the most dangerous thing in love isn't hate, it's possession. And just like that, as the sun set over Dien Bien and rose over the Amazon, the echoes of one tragedy gave way to the first breath of another. On the evening of May 10, 2020, in the Brazilian city of Manaus, lights shimmered over the Rio Negro like scattered jewels. Inside the packed auditorium of the Amazon Convention Center, the crowd erupted in applause as 25-year-old Kimberly Karen Moda walked onto the stage. Her sequined gown caught the spotlights, turning her into a living flare of silver and gold. She waved, smiled, and the sound that came back was thunderous. By the end of the night, the judges placed the crown on her head, declaring her Miss Amazonas. Cameras flashed. Her life, everyone thought, was only beginning. But behind the stage, away from the cheering, she sat quietly in front of the dressing room mirror, crown tilted slightly, phone buzzing in her purse. Dozens of unread messages lit up the screen, congratulations, invitations, and one name she didn't want to see, Rafael. She hesitated before opening it. The message was short: "We need to talk. You promised you'd call me." To most people, Kimberly was the embodiment of success, confident, radiant, fearless. Born and raised in Manaus, she had worked her way from local beauty contests to national modeling campaigns, often sending half her earnings back to support her parents. Her friends described her as kind, grounded, and stubbornly independent. She knew what she wanted, one friend said later, but she also believed she could fix people who were broken. That belief had led her to Rafael Fernandez Rodriguez, a fitness trainer she met during a charity event 2 years earlier. At first, he seemed perfect, charismatic, protective, devoted. He called her "Mayu Sol, my son," but over time his affection hardened into surveillance. He monitored her calls, questioned her wardrobe, and appeared at her photo shoots without warning. When she confronted him, he would cry, beg forgiveness, promise to change. And each time she forgave him. The night she won the crown, Rafael waited outside the venue. Witnesses recalled seeing him leaning against his motorcycle, face hidden beneath a black cap, eyes fixed on the exit. Kimberly slipped out a side door with 2 friends to avoid reporters. She didn't notice him follow. Manaus was a city of contrasts, luxurious high-rises standing beside dense rainforests, streets humming with life but shadowed by violence. Despite its beauty, it was known for rising cases of domestic homicide, many of them involving jealousy and control. Police officers had begun calling it the city of silent women because so many victims had never spoken of their fear until it was too late. Kimberly wasn't one of those silent women. She had filed a police report 6 months earlier after Rafael damaged her car during an argument. The restraining order that followed was meant to keep him away, but he violated it repeatedly, showing up at events, sending flowers with notes that said, "I forgive you." The police warned her to change her number, move apartments, even hire private security. "He's obsessed," one officer told her. She smiled politely and said, "I can handle him." That confidence was what made her magnetic and what made her vulnerable. In interviews, Kimberly spoke often about fear. "People think courage is the absence of fear," she said during a televised interview after her win. "It's not. It's doing what you love, even when fear is sitting next to you." To the audience, it sounded inspiring. To those who knew her, it sounded like a warning. A week after the pageant, Kimberly prepared for a photo shoot by the riverfront. The morning sun reflected off the water, and a gentle breeze carried the smell of orchids from a nearby market. She looked peaceful, radiant, unaware that Rafael had been tracking her location for days through a GPS tag he'd hidden in her car. That night, she posted her final photo to Instagram, a close-up of her smiling face captioned, "Grateful for everything life gives me. Even the storms." By dawn, she was gone. Her absence went unnoticed at first. Friends assumed she was resting, celebrating, taking time offline. But when she missed her scheduled flight to São Paulo for a modeling contract, and her phone went dark, her manager called the police. Detectives arrived at her apartment to find the front door locked from the inside, the balcony door ajar, and her keys still on the counter. There were no signs of struggle, only a perfume bottle knocked over beside the mirror, its glass cracked like a spider web. Within 24 hours, investigators traced CCTV footage from a nearby street showing Kimberly entering her apartment building at 10:47 p.m. and a shadow following 20 seconds later. The man wore a hoodie, his posture unmistakable. When detectives froze the frame, they saw the edge of a tattoo curling up from his collarbone, a pair of angel wings. It was Rafael. Before the crown and the headlines, Kimberly Karen Moda and Rafael Fernandez Rodriguez had looked like the perfect couple. Their photos filled social media, sunsets, gym selfies, handwritten captions about destiny. She called him her rock. He called her his reason to live. To everyone watching, it was modern romance. But the reality underneath was already starting to fracture. Friends noticed the small things first. He waited outside her studio during shoots, timing how long she stayed inside. He commented on every male colleague's name that appeared in her messages. He started asking to approve her wardrobe for events, saying it was only because he knew what looked best. Kimberly laughed it off at first, telling friends he was just protective. Then the protectiveness became rules: no after parties, no late calls, no unplanned trips. When she broke one, he would disappear for days, then return with flowers and apologies. She wanted to believe he could change. Raphael had grown up poor in a violent neighborhood on the outskirts of Manaus. His father had vanished when he was 8, his mother working long hours to keep him in school. As a teenager, he'd been bullied for his stutter and short temper. The gym became his sanctuary. Strength gave him identity, and identity became control. When he met Kimberly at a charity marathon, he saw in her not just beauty but validation, a life he thought he deserved. But what began as admiration turned into possession. Raphael followed her career obsessively, creating fake profiles to monitor fan comments. When she blocked him, he made new ones. He sent messages that swung between devotion and threat: "You're mine or you're no one's." She saved them all but never told police. "I don't want to ruin him," she told her makeup artist. "He's broken, not bad." By the time Kimberly won Miss Amazonas, Raphael's world had already begun to collapse. The restraining order humiliated him. The crown humiliated him more. His friends said he became withdrawn, angry, muttering that she had used him to climb. When he showed up outside her apartment one night and shouted her name until the neighbors called security, police detained him briefly but released him the next morning. He sent her a message afterward: "You can't block what you created." Kimberly tried to move on. She focused on charity work, promoting environmental campaigns in the Amazon region, modeling for local designers. But behind every public appearance was anxiety. Her team noticed she flinched whenever someone called her name too loudly. She changed her phone number twice, moved apartments, and stopped posting her location in real time. Yet somehow Raphael always found her. In late April, she told her friend Leticia that she planned to leave Manaus after the national competition. "If I win, I'll go to São Paulo," she said. "If I don't, I'll go anyway." Leticia remembered the way she said it, calm, resolved, as if she knew she wouldn't survive staying. The final argument happened 3 days before she disappeared. According to neighbors, Raphael arrived at her building around midnight. The doorman refused to let him in, citing the restraining order. Witnesses said he shouted for several minutes before leaving on his motorcycle, his voice echoing down the street. Kimberly called police to file a report. When officers asked if she wanted to press new charges, she said no. "He's angry now, but he'll stop," she said. He didn't stop. For the next 48 hours, he sent a flurry of messages, apologies mixed with accusations. "I can't live without you. You made me a fool. If I can't have peace, neither will you." Kimberly showed the text to her manager but dismissed suggestions of hiring security. "I don't want to look paranoid," she said. On May 10th, the night she vanished, Raphael's motorcycle was caught on camera circling her apartment complex 3 times between 10 and 11 p.m. At 10:47, she entered the building smiling and waving at a neighbor. 20 seconds later, the figure with the angel wing tattoo followed her inside. The next morning, when she failed to appear at her flight check-in, her manager's first call went to her mother, then to the police. Officers found no forced entry, no signs of struggle, just a faint smell of perfume and a broken bottle of champagne on the floor. It looked less like a crime scene and more like a moment frozen in time. Detective Laura Santos from the Manaus Homicide Division took the case. Her first impression was clear: this wasn't random. The pattern fit what she'd seen too many times: obsession escalating to violence, love curdling into control. She thought she was handling him, Santos told reporters later. But control doesn't stop when you ignore it. It just waits. The investigation would soon confirm what everyone feared. Kimberly's disappearance wasn't a mystery of chance. It was the final act in a story that had begun the moment Raphael decided love meant ownership. The last 24 hours of Kimberly Karen Moda's life were reconstructed through phone records, surveillance footage, and the memories of people who loved her. On the morning of May 10th, she woke early, sent her assistant a message confirming the photo shoot for that afternoon, and posted a short video of the sunrise over Manaus. "A new day," she said softly into the camera. No one watching could have known it would be her last. At noon, she met her friend Leticia at a cafe near Avenida Jaume Batista. Witnesses remembered laughter and clinking glasses, two women talking about travel plans. Kimberly spoke about moving to São Paulo, about starting over somewhere. No one knew her. She seemed calm, even optimistic. When she left, she hugged her friend and said, "Next time we talk, it'll be from a new city." From that moment, her day unfolded normally. She stopped at a florist, bought orchids for her mother, and returned home to pack. At 6 p.m., she sent a message to her manager. "Flight confirmed. See you tomorrow." Her phone location showed her inside her apartment at 8:30 p.m. Then at 10:47 p.m., she returned from a quick errand to buy bottled water. The security camera in the lobby caught her smiling, waving goodnight to the doorman. 20 seconds later, a man followed her inside wearing a dark hoodie. Investigators later determined that the building's back entrance lock had been jammed earlier that day. The maintenance staff assumed it was a technical glitch. In reality, Raphael had broken it deliberately hours before. Inside the apartment, forensic teams reconstructed what happened next. There were no signs of a prolonged struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken locks. Only small details told the story. A champagne bottle shattered on the floor, a single earring beneath the couch, a faint bruise on the doorframe. Kimberly had likely opened the door, willingly believing he had come to talk. At 11:04 p.m., a neighbor heard a loud thud, followed by silence. The building's security cameras lost feed for 5 minutes after that cut manually from the utility room. When they came back online, the elevator showed Raphael leaving with a large duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He walked calmly, looking at his reflection in the mirrored walls, then disappeared into the street. The next morning, Kimberly's mother called repeatedly. Each call went unanswered. When her manager arrived at the apartment around noon, she used the spare key. Kimberly kept hidden in the hallway planter. The lights were off. The air smelled faintly of perfume and bleach. In the bedroom, the bed was perfectly made. On the dresser lay her phone, still charging, and the crown from the Miss Amazonas pageant. Detective Laura Santos arrived within the hour. She noticed a drop of blood on the inside of the bedroom door and a trail of faint scuff marks on the balcony floor. Looking over the edge, she saw 2 small indentations in the flower box railing where something heavy had been propped. "He didn't carry her out through the hallway," she murmured. "He lowered her." Within days, the case gripped Brazil. National channels broadcast her face alongside grainy CCTV clips of the man in the hoodie. The phrase, "Onde está Kimberly?" "Where is Kimberly?" filled social media feeds, handwritten on posters, spoken in whispers across the city. The break came 72 hours later. A fisherman on the outskirts of Manaus reported a black duffel bag tangled in reeds near the riverbank. Inside, police found Kimberly's body wrapped in a sheet, her wrists bound with silk ribbon. The bag also contained a perfume bottle, identical to the one broken in her apartment. Forensic analysis confirmed she had died from strangulation between 11:00 and 11:10 p.m. The bruises on her arms suggested she had tried to fight back. Her nails contained traces of skin DNA. The match came back to Rafael Fernandez Rodriguez. Detective Santos faced the cameras that night. "We have identified the suspect," she said. "He was the last person to see her alive." Behind her, flashbulbs burst like lightning, illuminating a crowd desperate for answers. Across the city, billboards that once advertised beauty products now displayed Kimberly's photo and the word Justicia. Candlelight vigils formed outside her apartment at the pageant hall by the river. People left flowers, photos, and messages that read, "She deserved better." Meanwhile, Raphael had vanished. He turned off his phone, abandoned his apartment, and withdrew all the cash he could from several accounts. His motorcycle was found near a ferry dock leading toward the rainforest. For days, helicopters scoured the dense canopy. Posters with his face covered the city, describing him as armed, unstable, and extremely dangerous. Detective Santos knew the chase wouldn't last forever. "He's running on fear," she told her team. "Fear always runs out of fuel." And when it did, the city that had loved Kimberly would see the man who claimed to love her most, captured in the place he thought would hide him, the heart of the jungle itself. Months after the verdict, Rafael Fernandez Rodriguez began his sentence at a maximum security facility outside São Paulo. The prison walls stretched high and gray, topped with barbed wire that glinted under the midday sun. Reporters described him as unrecognizable, thinner, quieter, and visibly aged. Gone was the sculpted trainer who once stood beside a beauty queen. What remained was a man hollowed out by his own obsession. He spent the first weeks under isolation, monitored for suicide risk. Guards said he spoke to no one, refused visits, and spent hours staring at the concrete wall of his cell. Psychiatrists who evaluated him described a man incapable of distinguishing control from love. He believed that taking her life was an extension of keeping her close, one wrote. In his mind, the line between affection and annihilation no longer existed. While Raphael faded from public view, Kimberly's legacy grew brighter. The Kimberly Moda Foundation launched 3 months after her death, created by her family and local activists. Its mission was simple: to fund shelters and legal aid for women escaping violent partners. Within its first year, it had helped more than 400 survivors find new homes and protection. At vigils held across Brazil, women carried candles and wore white ribbons bearing her initials. Artists painted murals of her smiling face across the walls of Manaus, her crown replaced by a halo of orchids. The pageant world that once celebrated beauty began speaking openly about danger: backstage seminars, self-defense training, anonymous reporting hotlines. One organizer said, "She made us see what we never wanted to see, that the spotlight doesn't protect you, sometimes it blinds you." Detective Laura Santos was promoted to chief of the Homicide Division the following year. Reporters asked what she remembered most about the case. She paused, then said, "The moment we found her crown beside the mirror, it looked like it was waiting for her to come back." She kept a photograph of that scene on her office wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that every story of violence begins long before the first blow. Kimberly's parents lived quietly in the same small home on the outskirts of Manaus. Her mother tended orchids in the garden, her father repaired bicycles for neighborhood children. When journalists visited, they declined interviews but allowed one photograph, the family's dining room, where Kimberly's crown sat in a glass case beneath a framed photo of her final performance. The caption in the newspaper read, "The house where love and loss coexist." The man who had taken her life became a footnote in Brazil's criminal archives, one more entry in a list of men whose love turned lethal. But the woman he killed became a symbol that would not fade. Teachers told her story in classrooms, journalists wrote documentaries, and poets quoted her final Instagram caption, "Grateful for everything life gives me, even the storms." For Detective Santos, that sentence haunted her. She read it one last time, while closing her report, whispering to herself. She saw the storm coming and still stood tall. Years later, when asked why she continued working cases of domestic violence instead of taking a promotion to a quieter post, Santos answered, "Because every time I think it's over, another story begins the same way." She was right again. 2 years after Raphael's conviction in the American Midwest, another tragedy was quietly unfolding. In the small city of Independence, Missouri, an elderly woman named Louise Dickey hadn't been answering her phone. Neighbors thought she'd gone to visit family. But one evening, a young man entered her home, a man she'd once trusted to mow her lawn. What happened next would shock the entire community and reveal that danger doesn't always arrive with obsession or jealousy. Sometimes it comes wearing the face of desperation. On the afternoon of October 12, 2016, 79-year-old Louise Dickey stood on her front porch in Independence, Missouri, waving at her neighbor as fallen leaves rustled along the sidewalk. Her small white house on East 27th Street looked like something from another era, an American postcard still trapped in time. The shutters were painted sky blue, the garden was neatly trimmed, and the scent of cinnamon drifted from the kitchen where she'd just finished baking an apple pie. To anyone passing by, it was the image of safety. Louise had lived there for 40 years. A retired librarian, she was known for her habit of reading on her porch swing every evening with a cup of tea. Children on the block called her Grandma Lou. She kept extra snacks for delivery drivers, sent birthday cards to her neighbors' kids, and never missed Sunday service at the local Methodist church. Independence was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where kindness was currency and suspicion was impolite. Her husband Charles had passed away 5 years earlier. Since then, she filled her days with routines, morning walks, crossword puzzles, phone calls with her daughter Melissa, who lived 2 towns over. Melissa had begged her to move closer, but Louise always replied the same way, "I'm fine here, this house keeps me company." That October day was cool, the kind of weather that carried memories. She was expecting a handyman to stop by, a young man named Corey King, who'd offered to clean her gutters before winter. He'd done small jobs for neighbors before, and though some thought he seemed rough around the edges, Louise saw only a polite young man trying to make ends meet. She'd met him a few weeks earlier outside the grocery store, when he'd offered to carry her bags. He'd called her ma'am and refused extra payment. "He's a sweet boy," she told her daughter. Around 3 p.m. neighbors saw Corey's old silver sedan pull into Louise's driveway. They thought nothing of it. He carried a toolbox toward the house, waved at a passing mail carrier, and disappeared through the front door. No one noticed when he didn't come back out. At 5:30, Melissa called her mother, as she did every evening. The phone rang until voicemail answered. She tried again an hour later. Still nothing. Maybe she's napping, Melissa told herself. By nightfall, she began to worry. Louise never missed their calls. The next morning, when her mother still hadn't answered, Melissa drove the 40 miles from Blue Springs to Independence. The front door was locked, the curtains drawn. The car was in the driveway, and the mail from the previous day was untouched. She knocked, then called out, "Mom, it's me." No response. She contacted a neighbor, who called the police for a welfare check. Officers arrived around 11 a.m. and found no signs of forced entry. But when they entered through a side door that Louise sometimes forgot to latch, they noticed something wrong immediately. A chair was overturned in the living room. The kitchen smelled faintly metallic, On the counter sat the apple pie she had baked the day before, half-cut knife still beside it. When an officer opened the bedroom door, the world seemed to stop. Louise lay on the floor beside her bed, motionless, a thin bruise around her neck. Her nightstand drawers were open, jewelry boxes emptied. The scene spoke of sudden violence inside a space that had always felt sacred. Investigators found fingerprints on the back door, shoe prints near the bed, and a missing set of car keys. In the driveway, the old sedan that neighbors had seen the day before was gone. It didn't take long to connect the dots. Corey King, 25 years old, with prior arrests for drug possession and theft, had disappeared that same night. The story spread quickly across local news stations. Elderly woman murdered in her home. Independence wasn't used to headlines like that. Residents left candles on their porches, locked their doors for the first time, and watched the evening news in disbelief. Melissa spoke to reporters through tears. "My mom trusted everyone," she said. "She thought kindness could change people." Her voice cracked. It's what made her beautiful and what made her vulnerable. Detectives launched a citywide search for Corey King. They traced his phone to a gas station 2 hours away where he'd been caught on camera using Louise's credit card. The footage showed him pacing beside the counter, eyes darting, hands shaking. When the cashier handed him the receipt, he muttered something inaudible and left. He looked less like a killer and more like a man drowning in panic. By the second day, police found Louise's car abandoned near a rural field outside Independence. Inside were traces of blood, jewelry belonging to her, and a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey. It was clear now this wasn't premeditated. It was desperation turned lethal. Detective Alan Rivers, the lead investigator, summarized it best. He didn't break in for revenge or hate. He broke in for money. And when kindness met, addiction, kindness lost. The manhunt for Corey King began before sunrise on October 14th. Police from 3 neighboring counties joined the search, scouring every rural road, gas station, and motel between Independence and the Kansas border. Flyers with his mugshot papered convenience stores and telephone poles. He wasn't a stranger to law enforcement. He'd spent most of his 20s drifting between odd jobs, short stints in jail, and long nights chasing the next high. But this time, the city that once ignored him was hunting him. Detective Alan Rivers worked the case from a cramped office at the Independence Police Department. On his corkboard, photos of Louise Dickey's quiet home hung beside grainy security stills of Corey using her credit card. "He's broke, desperate, and scared," Rivers told his team. "That makes him sloppy." He was right. Later that morning, a tip came from a truck driver who'd picked up a hitchhiker matching Corey's description on Highway 50. The man said Corey had offered him a gold ring as payment for gas. When shown photos of Louise's jewelry, the driver nodded immediately. "That's the one," he said. The lead broke the case open. Detectives tracked his path through a string of small towns, Lee's Summit, Harrisonville, Clinton, each stop marked by an attempt to pawn something that wasn't his. By evening he'd made it as far as Warsaw, a lakeside town surrounded by woods. There he rented a room in a rundown motel under a false name using cash taken from Louise's wallet. Inside that motel room, Corey King stared at his reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. The man staring back looked nothing like the one Louise had welcomed into her home. His hands trembled as he tried to clean the bloodstains from his jacket. Every knock outside made him flinch. He kept telling himself it had been an accident, that she had startled him, that he hadn't meant to grab her that hard. But the image of her face, the moment her breathing stopped, replayed again and again. There was no running from that. When the police arrived the next morning, they found the motel clerk bound with duct tape but unharmed. Corey had fled on foot into the woods. Helicopters circled overhead while K-9 units combed the underbrush. The manhunt stretched for hours. Then, just before dusk, an officer spotted movement near a creek bed. Corey was crouched beneath a fallen tree, clutching a knife, his clothes torn and muddy. "Corey King," the officer shouted. "Drop the weapon." He hesitated, then raised his hands. "I didn't mean to kill her," he said, voice breaking. "I just needed money. I just wanted to leave." He was arrested without further struggle. Back in Independence, the news spread quickly. Suspect in Dickey murder captured. For the first time in days, neighbors exhaled. Melissa Dickey wept when detectives called. "Tell them thank you," she said. "Thank you for not letting him vanish like my mother did." During interrogation, Corey's story unfolded in fragments. He said Louise had offered him tea while he prepared to start work. When she turned her back to retrieve a plate from the cupboard, he saw her purse on the counter. "I just thought I'd take a little cash," he said. She caught me, grabbed my arm, and started yelling. I panicked. He described pushing her, then grabbing a scarf to silence her cries. "It happened so fast," he said. "I didn't think she'd stop breathing." Afterward, he took her keys, jewelry, and car, leaving the house as quietly as he could. Detectives listened in silence. The motive wasn't mystery or malice, it was addiction. Toxic, senseless, ordinary addiction. His drug habit had drained every ounce of his conscience until the only thing left was need. When the interview ended, Rivers closed his notebook and said, "You were the last person she trusted." Corey looked up, eyes glassy. "I know," he whispered. "She gave me pie." The simplicity of that statement haunted everyone in the room. The trial began the following summer. The prosecution presented DNA evidence, fingerprints, and Corey's confession. His defense attorney argued diminished responsibility, citing years of drug dependence and mental instability. But the jury took less than 4 hours to reach a decision: guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In his final statement, Corey wept and said, "If I could trade my life for hers, I would." The judge stared at him and replied, "You already did." At the sentencing, Melissa addressed the court. "My mother's kindness was not a weakness," she said. "It was her strength. And if there's anything good left in this world, it's that her story might make someone lock their door or say no when they feel uneasy. Maybe that will save another life." Outside, as the verdict echoed through the small Missouri courthouse, the autumn wind picked up, scattering yellow leaves across the steps. Reporters closed their notebooks, the cameras turned off. Independence for a moment was quiet again. But Detective Rivers knew silence doesn't last. Evil never really disappears, it just changes form, waiting for the next open door. Months passed after Corey King's conviction, and Independence slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. But for the people who had known Louise Dickey, nothing was quite the same. The porch where she once sat reading stayed empty, her garden overgrown with wildflowers she'd never have let run loose. The house at the corner of East 27th Street was eventually sold, but locals still slowed down when driving past, their eyes lingering on the faded shutters painted sky blue. For Melissa, grief was no longer a sharp pain, but a dull, constant ache. She visited her mother's grave every Sunday, bringing a fresh slice of apple pie wrapped in foil. "You always said food was love," she'd whisper, "so I'm still feeding you." Sometimes she stayed for hours just talking about her job, the neighbors, the weather. What she couldn't talk about was the guilt that lingered under every word. "I should have made her move," she told her husband once. I should have protected her from her own kindness. Detective Alan Rivers carried his own version of that guilt. He'd solved the case, secured the conviction, and received commendations, but none of it felt like victory. He'd seen too many cases where the good met the desperate and lost. On the wall of his office, he kept a photo of Louise taken from the newspaper, the same image, everyone in Missouri. Now recognized an elderly woman, smiling on her porch, sunlight falling across her shoulders. One evening while cleaning out case files, Rivers paused at her photo and said quietly, "You trusted someone because you couldn't see the monster inside him. That's what makes you better than him. And maybe that's why it hurts so much." The case had become more than a story of murder. It was a parable about the dangers of misplaced trust, but also about the value of compassion, even when the world tries to punish it. Local schools invited Rivers to speak about crime prevention. Instead of statistics, he told them about kindness. Lock your doors, he'd say, but don't lock your hearts. The world doesn't need fewer good people. It just needs fewer who take advantage of them. The Louise Dickey Memorial Fund was established by her daughter a year after the verdict. The goal wasn't vengeance but mercy. It provided small grants for addiction recovery programs and housing for ex-convicts rebuilding their lives. "If one person chooses rehab over robbery," Melissa said at the launch, "then my mother's story isn't just about how she died. It's about how she keeps saving people." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman whose generosity cost her life had even in death inspired others to give again. For Corey King, life behind bars became its own slow punishment. He worked in the prison laundry, spoke little, and attended mandatory counseling. Guards said he kept a Bible on his bunk but rarely read it. One counselor reported that during sessions, he never defended himself, never blamed addiction or circumstance. "She trusted me," he said once. "That's what I remember when I try to sleep. She trusted me." When news of the Memorial Fund reached him through the prison newsletter, he asked the warden for a form to donate his commissary wages. It was barely enough to matter, but it was something. "Tell her daughter," he said, "I don't expect forgiveness. I just don't want to be remembered for the worst thing I ever did." The warden didn't deliver the message. Some things he thought were better left between God and the guilty. In Independence, every October 12th, the town holds a candlelight vigil at the small Methodist church where Louise once volunteered. They call it the Night of Kindness. Neighbors bake pies, share stories, and light candles for victims of violence. Melissa never speaks during the event. She just stands near the altar, head bowed, holding her mother's favorite book of poetry. Detective Rivers attends too, always standing at the back, his badge tucked away. When the candles flicker and the congregation begins to sing softly, he looks toward the open church doors and whispers, "We caught him, ma'am, but what you taught us mattered more than that." Outside, the Missouri night hums with the sound of crickets and distant traffic. The houses glimmer with warm light behind curtains, families finishing dinner, children laughing, dogs barking. Life goes on, fragile, ordinary, beautiful. And somewhere in that fragile quiet, in the space between fear and faith, the story of Louise Dickey finds its peace. When we began tonight, it was only a sound faint against the window, steady, harmless. But after hearing these 5 stories, it feels different now. It's no longer just weather, it's memory. It's the world reminding us that no matter how much time passes, grief and mercy fall the same way, quietly, equally, without discrimination. We've walked through 5 lives together: Lin Chi, the wife whose warmth was buried beneath ice; Trun Thi Kim, the mother taken as payment for another's sin; Duyen, the student who delivered chickens and never came home; Kimberly, the beauty who believed love could tame danger; and Louise, the grandmother who opened her door one last time. 5 people who lived in different worlds, spoke different languages, and never knew each other, yet their stories shared a single thread. Each one trusted, each one loved, each one believed the world was still good. And in that belief, each met the one thing that goodness can't always protect us from the human heart when it breaks wrong. If there's something these stories have shown us, it's that evil doesn't announce itself with thunder. It comes softly, in small decisions, in debts, unpaid, in obsessions left to grow. It hides behind smiles, behind apologies, behind promises that sound almost true. But there's another truth, quieter and just as powerful. Goodness echoes longer than cruelty. The ripples of one kind act. One person who refuses to become bitter outlast the worst that violence can take away. Think of Lin Chi's daughter lighting incense in Houston, of Kim Tran's family, building a foundation in her name, of Duyen's village, where people now walk each other home, of Kimberly's crown shining on murals across Brazil, of Louise's daughter feeding others because her mother fed everyone. They're gone, yes, but they left trails of light behind them, faint but steady like the reflection of street lamps in wet pavement. The investigators who carried these cases, Morrison in Oregon, Nguyen in Sydney, Hoang in Dien Bien, Santos in Manaus Rivers in Missouri, each learned the same lesson: solving the crime isn't the end. Justice is paperwork. Compassion is the hard part. It's staying human after seeing what humans can do. Maybe that's why we tell these stories. Not to relive the horror, but to remember the people inside it, the laughter before the silence, the warmth before the cold, the rain before the storm. So wherever you are tonight, whether you're listening in a dark room, driving home through the quiet streets, or lying awake with only the hum of the world outside your window, take a breath and remember them. Not for how they died, but for how they lived. Because right now the rain has started again. You can hear it if you listen closely, tapping against the glass, gentle but insistent. It's the same rain that fell on Houston and Sydney, on Dien Bien and Manaus and Missouri. It's patient, forgiving, endless. It falls on every grave and every survivor the same way. And maybe that's the point. The rain doesn't ask who deserved it. It just keeps falling, washing over what's broken, softening the sharp edges, giving the world one more chance to begin again. Thank you for staying with me through these stories, for listening all the way to the end. If you haven't already, please subscribe, drop a comment letting me know your thoughts, and most importantly, take care of each other out there. The rain is still falling steady and cold. There's always another story waiting in the darkness. Leave a light on tonight,